The environment is full of both natural and anthropogenic toxic substances that we're exposed to each day. Most of these substances we do not know much about. We don't understand their toxicity, what tissues or organs they may target, how they are cycled through the ecosystem, and what may constitute safe exposure limits. We're going to look at 4 persistent pollutants. All 4 of these are man-made compounds. We've already looked at one of them, chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, and how they were involved in destroying the ozone. We'll also look at diphenyl trichloroethane, which is DDT, an insecticide that was used widely all over the world. Polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, which was a man-made product used in hydraulics and coolants. And we'll look at bisphenol A, BPA. This is a molecule that is used to produce plastics. In addition to understanding these persistent pollutants, how they're cycled through the environment, what tissues and organs they target in humans and other mammals and other organisms, we'll explore information and scientific literacy. We, with Twitter, with Facebook, with the internet, with instant messages, we are inundated with information throughout the day. Some of this is very reliable, some of this is misinformation that comes from the popular press. And we're going to investigate the differences between reliable sources of information that come from scientists that are published in professional journals, primary sources. We'll look at reliable and well-respected secondary sources such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and we'll also talk about some of the tertiary sources of information that we may be exposed to each day. However, the information that they present may not be a reliable source of information. Developing these skills allows us to better evaluate the trustworthiness or the usefulness of various sources of information, and it allows us to begin to understand some of the toxicity natures with many of these pollutants. How toxic is a compound? How is its toxicity determined? How do they react with one another in the environment? How do they react with one another in our bodies? Are there safe doses for these compounds? And how are we exposed to them in our daily lives? We'll cover Chapter 3 of our textbook. The title is Information Literacy and Toxicology, Toxic Bottles on the Trail of Chemicals in Our Everyday Lives. Bisphenol A, or as it's commonly referred to, BPA, has been widely used all over the world since the 1940s as a synthetic compound, a man-made compound used in plastic production. And it was used in food packaging to line cans that held soup, for example, drink packaging, infant bottles, compact discs, bottle tops, food cans, supply water chains, medical equipment. All of these different products that we use day in and day out were manufactured with BPA. In 2008, the U.S. government panel of scientists that was collectively known as the National Toxicology Program came out with a consensus finding that constant exposure to this compound raised considerable concerns on the effects of brain behavior and prostate glands in fetuses, infants, and children at the current human exposure to this compound. And this raised a lot of concern for people all over the world since BPA was found in virtually every plastic compound product out there. At the time, European Union and Canada were considering banning this product altogether from anything that was manufactured or used in their countries. And today you'll see a big push all over the world to using plastics that do not contain BPA. So many of the plastic products that you buy, if you look on the label, it will read does not contain BPA. The major concern was with infants because they were using, in many cases, bottles, plastic bottles that were manufactured with BPA, and there was a great deal of concern about feeding, every 3 hours, giving your baby a bottle and exposing them to constant levels of BPA, and what is that going to cause because their daily exposure is so high. How is that going to affect their development? How is it going to affect their capacity to become healthy young children and successful adults? The National Institutes of Health, a government agency that's funded by U.S. tax dollars, provides a tremendous amount of information about all sorts of pollutants and man-made compounds. I invite you to go to their website. It's www.nih.gov/health/topics/agents. And on this website, you'll be able to find all sorts of environmental agents, from formaldehyde that's in building products, lead, mercury, nanomaterials, pesticides, soy infant formula, water pollution, electric and magnetic fields, dioxins, bisphenol A, arsenic, allergens, and irritants. And they will give you tremendous amounts of information from peer-reviewed primary source articles from scientists and professors all over the world. You'll also find health links there. For example, the 13th edition of the report on carcinogens, and this is a very extensive report on different carcinogens that are in the environment, what the target organs are, what safe levels are, if there is any, chronic diseases that are caused, acute diseases, how they may affect children's health, what populations are most vulnerable, how are you exposed to this? For example, do you get it in your drinking water? Do you get it in some of the products that we use each day? So this is a very good source of information, and I think perhaps the most important thing that I can give you from this class is I can point you in the right direction to find the best source of information, the highest respected source of information, so that as you go on throughout your lives, as you raise children, as you decide what products to buy, where to live, you can make well-informed decisions about how you're going to raise your child, what products do you want your child to be exposed to, what areas do you want to avoid. Also on this site, you'll find a scorecard. It's a link, and on this you can find where pollutants are being released near where you live. You enter your zip code and you receive all sorts of information about toxic compounds from animal waste, from agriculture, air quality, lead, mercury hazards, and how they may be in your watershed. So again, the National Institutes of Health, they're there to help you. Your tax dollars pay for that, and I invite you and really encourage you to visit this site, not just now, but as you're an adult and as you make decisions throughout your lives. And here's the website, niehs.nih.gov/health/topics/agents. Go to this website and you can learn a great deal about the different compounds that you're exposed to each day, how they affect your body, how you can avoid them, and what some of the safe levels are considered by the National Institutes of Health. Bisphenol A is a synthetic compound. It's man-made. When it was manufactured in the 1940s, we didn't know that it caused these health effects, And we didn't manufacture them because we wanted to kill people. We manufactured them because we knew we could use them to line metal food cans, and the soup that you buy, the tomato soup, would taste like tomato soup. It would not taste like tomato soup and that metal can. We also used it in the production of other plastics. In the medical community, if you go to the hospital, you don't want to reuse much of the materials, the plastics, the syringes, and other things, because you have pathogens. And so the plastic industry was great for medicine because they were one-time uses. You could put that syringe, you could put that in the person, inject the medicine, and then throw it away, and you didn't have to worry about contaminating the next patient that came in. Unfortunately, studies in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then into the 80s and 90s really began to show BPA was a man-made compound. We made it because we wanted the products, we wanted the services, we wanted the goods, we wanted the benefits. Just like chlorofluorocarbons. We looked at the last chapter. CFCs were banned during the Montreal Protocol. It led to banning them in all countries, about 200 of them. And again, these were manufactured in a laboratory because we could use them as refrigerants. We could have useful properties and services for them, store our food safely, and prevent us from getting food poisoning. It turns out that they have some negative effects. That is very often the case with man-made compounds. We produce them, and we as humans become the guinea pigs. They're not tested extensively over years and years and years to see the negative impacts. And so when we have a new compound, one of the biggest products today that is of a concern for scientists is nanomaterials. We have a lot of compounds that are extremely small, much, much smaller than a cell. And because of that, they can get into our cells in mammalian tissues, and they may be causing health problems that we are not yet aware of. And so all of these things are manufactured not that we wanted to cause human misery, but because we wanted to help humanity. But as we begin to use them over and over and over again, we become living laboratories and guinea pigs, and we begin to see how they affect our bodies, how they affect our organs, and that makes us, forces us to look at these compounds and products and say, well, maybe they're not so great for us, maybe we need to stop manufacturing them, and in fact we need to find out where they are in the ecosystem and take care of them if we can, because they are very harmful to humanity and to the ecosystem. Anthropogenic or man-made or synthetic doesn't always mean that it's toxic. There are many man-made compounds that we use every day that aren't toxic to humans, at least we don't know of them as being toxic today. There are many natural compounds that are toxic. So just because something's natural doesn't mean that it is good for you. Uranium is natural. We find it out in the environment. It doesn't mean it's good for you. It causes cancer, so we avoid it. Arsenic is a natural compound, very often found in groundwater in the United States, India, and elsewhere around the world. It's natural. Mercury, it's natural, doesn't mean that it's good for you. This is DDT, this is the insecticide, this is synthetic. We used it because we wanted to kill the mosquitoes that vectored malaria and other diseases. And you can see that when it was used in the 1940s, they're spraying it out of the back end of this truck. This is a young man here, there's another young man on the beach, and they're exposed to this their entire body. They're breathing it in, it's getting in their mucus, it's getting in their eyes, it's getting on their skin. And at the time, we used it to kill insects. We did not know it had all these other negative side effects. We're also going to talk about Rachel Carson and her famous book, Silent Spring, which was one of the first examples of how man-made compounds can have disastrous effects on the ecosystem and disastrous effects on humanity. and specifically she was looking at this insecticide DDT. Throughout this lecture, we're also going to explore how much is safe. We're exposed to these compounds day in and day out, whether they're small doses of arsenic, whether they're large doses of bisphenol A, a man-made compound. We're, through the natural course of our lives, exposed to these. Through the air, through what we drink, through what we eat, through our contact on our skin, through our eyes. If we go swimming, you're bathed in some of these compounds. And we need to know how much is safe and how much exposure we can have each day and not have to worry about the negative side effects. And safe exposure limits also often vary with gender, with race, with age. So if you have a young white male, the safe levels are going to be completely different than an elderly female black individual. So races versus genders versus all of these things are going to affect what organs they target, how they affect the development of that person, and what constitutes a safe level. This is Rachel Carson, who is one of the best examples for taking information that was published by the scientific community, distilling that, getting rid of a lot of the jargons, and then publishing it in a book which she titled Silent Spring. And in this book she outlined some of the consequences of using the insecticide DDT. She had three specific concerns that she outlined. First was that some chemicals have large effects even in very minute small doses. Each day as you take water out of the drinking fountain or water from home, you're exposed to small amounts of toxins. These toxins are not removed at our wastewater treatment facilities. It's too expensive, and in some cases we don't have the technology to remove them yet. You're exposed to these really small doses, and they may be having some impacts on your health or the health of your children. And we're going to explore that a little bit later. She also wanted to point out that certain stages in human development, from an embryo to fetus to a small child to adolescent to an adult to an elderly, these are going to have different effects when they're exposed to these toxins. And also, throughout our daily lives, we're not just exposed to one toxin in the morning, one toxin at lunch, and one toxin in the afternoon, but rather we're being exposed to dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of different compounds. They're mixed together, and we as scientists and engineers do not understand what the effects by mixing these together are going to have on your health. One result of her book, Silent Spring, was a movement, an environmental movement, a health movement towards stricter regulations for chemical pesticides and its use in the United States, which it is banned in the United States and Europe and most other countries around the world. The book itself was titled Silent Spring because in the springtime, rather than hearing birds chirping and singing and baby birds growing up into adults, we were not experiencing this. It was very silent, and that's because of the negative effects of DDT on the bird populations in making their eggs very brittle, and as a result, the birds were not able to hatch and be ready to live in the world, and it killed off large populations of birds in the United States and elsewhere. Rachel Carson's book was published in 1962, and if you remember from our first lecture, we talked about the different movements that the United States went through, and in the mid-1900s was really an environmental awareness, an environmental movement towards an understanding of how something like dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane or DDT can accumulate and move through a food web and cause all sorts of disastrous consequences. As I mentioned before, bird eggs were made brittle by the accumulation of this insecticide, and as a result, the reproductive success of many of these birds, particularly predators like eagles and hawks, were in decline because they weren't able to reproduce. We're going to watch large sections of this video titled Poisoned Waters, which again was published by PBS Frontline and Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Hendrik Smith. This is the link to the site right now, but throughout this lecture and lectures in the future, we will be watching many of the chapters. When we talk about DDT and the concern within the ecosystem, we're mainly talking about its bioaccumulation in food webs. And so you can start out with very small quantities of this compound in the water. It gets into the water because the rain takes it there, gravity takes it there. This becomes incorporated in the photosynthetic organisms as they live in that water, as they use photosynthesis to make their sugars. They also incorporate small amounts of DDT into their cellular molecules. These are consumed by organisms that are a little bit higher up the food chain, such as shrimp, which are consumed by organisms a little bit higher up than that, like the American eagle, consumed by the American needlefish, and then finally you have these consumers at the top of the food web, in this case a ring-billed gull, or it could be a human up here, and as you move up, the concentration has gone from very small, 0.00005 parts per million, all the way up to 75.5 parts per million. This is an increase of 1.5 million. And this is the process of bioaccumulation. It stays within the molecules as these molecules are consumed by these guys, or consumed by these guys, or consumed by these guys, and finally up into the galls. You've had this bioaccumulation, and this is where it's going to affect the eggs, and they become brittle, they break, the infants can't hatch properly, and as a result, they die. Some of the concepts that we're going to explore, we're going to look at different toxins such as DDT. We're going to look at persistent chemicals. These are chemicals that persist, that stay in the environment for decades and decades, sometimes for centuries, sometimes for millennium, sometimes for millions of years in the case of uranium. We're going to look at risk assessment and precautionary principles. This is something we really don't use in the United States. Like I mentioned before, we're mainly guinea pigs. We have a new product, it's great, it's going to revolutionize the way we communicate, revolutionize the way we make money. So we have this product, we use it every day, and 10 years down the road we determine that it causes something like cancer. We're going to look at risk assessments. Can you look at a compound and make decisions? What are the economic forces? What are the forces and how it's going to impact the ecosystem, how it's going to affect our health, what are our needs for these chemical compounds, and that's going to determine whether or not we should continue to produce this compound. We're going to weigh the costs and benefits associated with this chemical. In reality, it's impossible to fully understand and assess all the potential interactions that we have. And so in reality, we are all guinea pigs that are being tested, and we're trying to determine whether or not this is going to impact our health and the health of the ecosystem. European countries tend to favor the precautionary principle. U.S. states tend to favor innocent until proven guilty. And the precautionary principle is better safe than sorry. So most European countries want to know, what are the exposure limits that we need to have for these compounds? What are the target organs? And once we understand this, we can make a decision about whether this product should be manufactured, and if it is, what products or where should it interact with humans. In the United States, we generally leave this burden of proof on the public. We become human laboratories, guinea pigs, so to speak, and we're testing these each day, and we'll understand in 10 years if they're causing negative consequences, and at that time we will then make the decision not to use that compound anymore. In the United States, the government agency that regulates and bans harmful compounds is the U.S. FDA, Food and Drug Administration. The address for the Food and Drug Administration is fda.gov. And again, this is a organization that's through the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and that is funded by your tax dollars. At the website, you can learn about recalls, you can learn about enforcements, outbreaks for foodborne illnesses. They have information for consumers, vaccinations, bloods, biologics, medical devices, animals, veterinary care, cosmetics, tobacco products, food, drugs, medical devices. So it's a great place to go. And again, the information that is contained in here comes from primary source journal articles. These are peer-reviewed, very high-quality articles, excellent reputation, the best in the world for information that is reliable and can tell you how and when and why you're being exposed to these compounds, what you can avoid, and what you can do to prevent some of the negative side effects. And so I talked about journal articles and primary source articles. These are your best sources of information. This is information that's being published in professional journals such as Science, Nature, Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, New England Journal of Medicine. This is new and original information from research. It is rigorously reviewed by peers in the scientific community for design, experimental design, data analysis, and the ability to use this information and to make better decisions in our lives. When I say it's rigorously reviewed by peers, in many of these journals, when I, as a scientist, a professor, I write something that I want to publish about my research, I submit it to Science or Nature, for example, for publication. The rejection rate is extremely high. Science and Nature may keep less than 5% of all the manuscripts that they receive, and they reject the remaining 90 to 95%. And that's because they have to be reviewed for the information that is contained. And so when you go to the sites that I describe in class, when you go to the sites that we describe in our Twitter feed, you can rest assured that this is the best source of information that you have access to. You can read these sources of information and make your own decisions on the products, on the chemicals, on whatever the issue is being written about in the article. And that's really the key for informational literacy. You need to develop an ability to distinguish between a reliable source, such as a journal, and an unreliable source, such as someone's blog. The blog, the internet, many of these are not rigorously reviewed by professionals in the medical community, in the engineering community, in the biochemistry community, in the ecosystem science community, and as a result, in many of these tertiary sources, you cannot trust the information. So primary sources are your best source of information. Again, these are journals, they're published by professors, and these are rigorously reviewed before they are published. A good source of information for, or a good database to find well-respected journal articles is PubMed. If you go to PubMed, these are all primary source journal article. PubMed is operated by the National Institutes of Health. Your tax dollars operate this service, and it is free to use. You can go there, type in the search engine whatever you want to know, having to do mainly with biological topics such as medicine, and get very well-respected, peer-reviewed articles, your best source of scientific information. Now, that isn't to say that you cannot trust other sources. Secondary sources, examples of these are books, magazines, review articles, newspapers, reference books, and websites. Many of these are well-respected, reliable sources. Government agencies are a very good example of reliable sources. Anything that has .gov after it is a government institution, such as the Food and Drug Administration, such as the National Institutes of Health, and these are very reliable sources of information. Others include the U.S. or the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the International Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, World Meteorological Association. These are, again, all well-respected sources. They take the information that is contained within the peer-reviewed articles, and they remove a lot of the scientific jargon that make it difficult to understand, and they put it in layman's terms so that you can go to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's website and you can learn about recalls on different products. You can learn about warnings for chemicals that are being manufactured and used in medical devices, for example. You can learn about vaccines. What are in your vaccines? What are some of the negative consequences? What are the positive consequences of using these vaccines? Some very good newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal would be three very good sources of information. Locally, the Columbus Dispatch is a very well-respected newspaper. Magazines in the scientific community, Scientific America is a very good example. We're all familiar with the Discovery Channel. We're all familiar with PBS, Public Broadcasting. They have series such as Frontline, Nova, Nature. Again, these are secondary sources. They don't just have to be in print. They can be videos that you can watch on TV, and you can learn a lot about what has been published in the primary sources. The tertiary sources are really the sources of information that should be avoided. These, in many cases, have an alternative motive. They may have a cultural or a political or religious agenda, and so the information that is contained in these is not reliable. Just because a blog says something about some product doesn't mean that it has went through the rigorous peer review process that it has over here. Doesn't mean that it has the reputation that the New York Times has, and so this is a source that should be avoided at all costs. They very often have errors because they do not rely on original sources like secondary sources do, and they also may perpetuate errors because they have an agenda and they're going to push this on to pursue this agenda, put it at the top of the list. So for this class and for the rest of your life, you should have a very good understanding that the primary source, the journal articles, are where you should go first. You can find these articles on websites like pubmed.gov. Secondary sources, you can find excellent information about research that's being conducted if you go to government websites, if you go to places like the United Nations website, and if you look at well-respected books and journals published by well-respected editors and authors. The Centers for Disease Control, CDC, which is another government institution based out of Atlanta, Georgia, an excellent source of information from peer-reviewed journal articles. The CDC collected 2,000 urine samples from a diverse community of humans in the United States. They found that 90% of these people tested positive for BPA. The average concentration of bisphenol A in their urine was 2.6 parts per billion. Some of them had very high concentrations, 16 parts per billion. They found that concentration decreased with age, meaning that infants were exposed to and had higher concentrations of BPA in their urine. Greatest exposure among young people were from products that used BPA, such as this bottle. that was used in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even 2000s in the United States and elsewhere. The BPA was leaching from the plastics in these materials, but just because it's leaching does not mean that it's harmful to humans. So just because we're finding it in there, we still have to do tests to determine what effects that it is causing on humans. When we talk about parts per billion, 2.6 parts per billion, that is 1 part per billion is one little drop in a very large volume of material. So if you've seen a tanker truck driving gasoline to the gas station, if you put 1 raindrop in there, that's about 1 part per billion. So 1 part per 1 billion molecules. The Environmental Protection Agency sets the safe level of mercury in water at 2 parts per billion. And we have these safe levels for all of these heavy metals in our drinking water, and some of these are extremely small levels. If you're exposed to higher than 2 parts per billion mercury in your drinking water, it can have excessive damage on your kidneys and other organs, which can be really detrimental to your lives. So when we look at things like BPA, which is a synthetic compound, a man-made compound that we use in plastics, that we use in the lining of food cans and plastic bottles, different other products, we need to understand, one, how you're being exposed to it, where it's coming from, how long is it staying in the body, are you able to excrete it in your urine, or does it stay in your fatty tissues? We're going to look at one of the things is its persistence. Low persistent compounds break down very quickly in the environment. Sunlight may break them down. Microbial activity may break those compounds down very quickly. So if you have a pollutant in the environment, but you have microorganisms in that soil and water that are going to break them down into harmful subunits that are not going to negatively impact the ecosystem, and so we're not going to worry as much about those. If a compound persists for a long period of time and has high persistence, that means that it's going to stay in the environment for very long periods of time. It does not break down, and as a result, its potential environmental impact is going to last for very long periods of time, and we're going to have to worry about this because it's going to be in the environment for long periods of time. Many synthetic or man-made compounds cannot be broken down because these are new compounds. Microorganisms have not evolved with these compounds, so they don't have the machinery to break them down to use them as energy sources. And so these things are going to persist in the environment and not be broken down. Other natural compounds can be converted into unnatural or into not as harmful compound by these microbes, or they can be broken down completely because these microbes have the ability and have the cellular machinery to break these down. You can see here these drums. We're going to talk about later how we store many of the compounds, for example in plutonium production, in drums like this. The compounds that are inside of there last for much longer than the metal in the drum. And so you have holes develop in these drums, that compounds that are liquid come out of the drums and they contaminate the ecosystem. If you fish in areas like the Great Lakes, you are probably aware of these caution signs that let you know that the fish you catch may have high concentrations of mercury, for example, and they give you safe limits on how much fish you should eat, what type of fish you can eat, for example, walleye or bluegill or perch or tuna, and by staying under those limits, you will really limit your exposure and the negative side effects that come along with mercury, with cadmium, with chromium, with many of these other compounds that persist and bioaccumulate in food webs. In addition to persistence, we need to know where that molecule is going to go once you ingest it or once it's in the ecosystem. A water-soluble compound will form bonds with water, and as a result, it's going to be passed through your tissue much quickly. It's going to be passed through the ecosystem much quicker. So this is water, H2O. It's able to form hydrogen bonds with other compounds, and if you have a compound that is water soluble, it's able to form bonds with water and move where water takes it. These compounds can still be very toxic. It doesn't mean that because it's water soluble doesn't mean it's safe for you, but it just tells us where that molecule is going to go when you ingest it. Is it going to pass out through your urine, or is it going to stay in your body? This is also going to have an impact on aquatic organisms. If a toxic compound is very water soluble, when it spills into a lake, it's going to spread very quickly over long distances. It's going to impact a larger area, and it's going to be very difficult to clean up. Opposed to that are fat-soluble compounds. If you've done any cooking and you put oil in water, you know that that oil is a fat. It's a lipid. It does not like water. It will form bulbs together that float on the surface of the water. Does not like to mix. And so if you were to spill this material in the lake, it would be much easier to clean up because these lipid fat-soluble compounds are going to be stuck together right there in a blob on the surface of the lake, and you'll be able to extract it very easily. The problem with the fat-soluble compounds is once they get into your body, into humans, they're going to stay in your fatty tissue. They're going to be able to cross your membranes. Your membranes in your cell are lipid bilayers, and so these fatty compounds can go right through those lipid bilayers. Once they get inside your cell, they can bind to things like DNA, and they can turn genes on or off that are not supposed to be turned on and off. And also, finally, these fat-soluble compounds are going to accumulate in your fatty tissue. And so you're going to keep them in your body for years and years and years, maybe for your entire life. And any other organism that eats you is then going to take those compounds and incorporate them in their fatty tissue. So if Tyrannosaurus rex comes along and eats you, all of those persistent fat-soluble compounds that are in your fatty tissues are now going to be incorporated into T. rex's fatty tissues. If we look at BPA, bisphenol A, it is fat soluble. However, the liver can quickly convert this into a water soluble compound, and that's how we pass it out through our urine. And that's why 90% of humans have BPA in their urine, because we are continuously exposed to this in the plastics that we use every day, and our liver is quickly converting these from a fat-soluble compound to a water-soluble compound, and that water-soluble compound follows the water right out our bodies in our urine. Fat-soluble compounds can accumulate within the tissue, the cells of an organism. So over time, this fish is going to grow from this cute little baby fish into this massive tuna that we're going to catch and eat. But the DDT that are in very small concentrations, maybe 1 or 2 parts per billion, are going to be ingested by this fish. And because DDT is a fat-soluble compound, it's going to accumulate in the fatty tissue of that fish. As that fish grows over months and years, more and more of this DDT is going to accumulate in the fatty tissue. And then finally, you're going to be having a mature tuna. It's going to have a lot of DDT that can make it sick, and it can also impact humans because this is the fish that we're going to catch and eat. And this is the fish that has very high concentrations of DDT. If we catch this guy here, we're probably going to throw him back in the water. And so this is why fat-soluble compounds in small concentrations in large bodies of water can pose great risk to us, because over time they have accumulated into the organisms that you and I eat at our supper table. In addition to bioaccumulation is the process of biomagnification. And again, we're talking about fat-soluble compounds. These are compounds that don't like water. They like to be with the oils. They like to be in the fatty tissue in your body. So higher up the food chain, you'll be able to consume the entire lifetime of toxins of their prey. good example are two organisms that we eat, tuna and swordfish. They are predators. They eat smaller fish, and as a result, they magnify things like mercury, polychlorinated biphenyls, and the insecticide DDT. So you have these small, cute little fish here that have small concentrations, very dilute concentrations of DDT. This fish here is a predatory fish. It's going to ingest these guys here, and over time, months, years and years, they're going to bioaccumulate this in their tissue. And so this is the process of biomagnification of this toxin up the food web. You have a human right here, and the human eats this guy, and so we're going to be exposed to this high level of PCBs, DDT, or mercury in this fish. And this is how we get them into our diet, and this is how it becomes incorporated in our tissues, in our organs, and it can cause health effects for humans. These are two of literally hundreds of persistent compounds that we're going to talk about in this class. These are not standalone, the only two that you should worry about. As I mentioned before, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of these. These are the two that we're going to focus on, though, because I think that most of you have heard about them and are familiar with them. DDT is dichloryl diphenyl trichloroethane. This is what it looks like. And this is the molecule that Rachel Carson wrote about in Silent Spring. These are the hydrophobic parts of the molecule, or the lipid-soluble parts of the molecule. These do not like water. These are water-hating, hydrophobic. And so when you have water in the presence of these molecules, the water stays by itself over here, and these molecules clump together, and they stay in your fatty tissue, and they accumulate in your fatty tissue. These also have very long half-lives. A half-life is how long is it going to stay in the environment, and I'll show you here in the next few slides what I mean. These have a half-life of decades, which means they're going to persist in the environment for long periods of time. They were first synthesized in 1874. They were banned in the United States in 1972, and they're banned by most other countries in the 70s and 80s. However, countries around the world still use DDT because it is very effective insecticide. It was originally developed and used during World War II in the Pacific Theater to prevent the spread of malaria. Malaria is spread by Anopheles mosquitoes, and we didn't want our troops developing malaria, so we killed all the mosquitoes with DDT, and voila, our troops are safe from malaria. Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine was actually awarded by Paul Mueller in 1948 for his discovery of its insecticidal properties. It is a carcinogen. It causes developmental and reproductive problems in humans. It's found in soils and waters. No doubt you have been exposed to this throughout your lives. It's hydrophobic, and as a result, it accumulates in fatty tissue. It was widely used as an insecticide for decades. And as I mentioned before, its environmental impact was outlined in the book Silent Spring in 1962 that was written by Rachel Carson. Over here we have another compound, PCB, polychlorinated biphenyls. These were man-made compounds that were first synthesized in the 1800s and widely used in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s during World War II and after World War II. The toxicity of PCBs was first reported in the 30s and 40s. Manufacturing of this compound peaked in the 1960s. Again, this is a product. This was used in the electrical industry and the airline industry, and we're going to look at Seattle, Washington. Boeing is a major manufacturing of airlines. It has been for the last century, and unfortunately the Boeing plants around the Seattle area have high concentrations of PCB. This material goes where water and gravity takes it. It's found in soil, it's found in water, it's also found in the atmosphere. It's a carcinogen, causes developmental and reproductive toxicities. It's also a neurotoxin. And when we look at Seattle, we're going to look at Puget Sound and how it affects the orca population in the Puget Sound, or killer whale populations. So it's not just that it affects humans, but it affects all mammals. We, through evolution, are very similar in our biochemistry, physiology, and anatomy, and so if it's impacting humans, it's most likely going to have a negative impact on other mammals as well. It's a pollutant in the Great Lakes, so here in Ohio, no doubt you have been exposed to this. Puget Sound, Hudson River watershed, Indiana, and New York State are very good examples of where you can be exposed to this compound. General Electric and Boeing are two of the largest companies that are probably most well respected around the world. But again, just because you're well respected doesn't mean that you don't have a few skeletons in your closet, and unfortunately their use of PCBs are one of those. Again, this is PCB. This is a hydrophobic part of the molecule. These are all carbons and hydrogens here. There are no OH groups, and so they cannot form the hydrogen bonds with water, and as a result they're going to be lipid soluble, they're going to hate water, and they're going to stick in your fatty tissues. They're going to bioaccumulate in food webs, and when you and I ingest them, for example, in eating a nice fat juicy tuna at the sushi bar, we're going to be exposed to higher concentrations, and it's going to accumulate in our fatty tissues and cause health problems for us. When we talk about persistence, we want to know how long is this compound going to last in the environment. And we often use the term half-life to describe how long it's going to last in the environment. In this example, we have blue dots, and let's just say these blue dots are really toxic and you don't want to be near them, and they have a half-life in 2 years. And a half-life by definition is the time required for the quantity to fall by half. So if we start with this many blue dots in the year 2016, how many are we going to have 2 years after that? So you go to the year 2018, and we have this many blue dots. You go to the year 2020, and we have half of that amount, this many blue dots. You go to the year 2022, and we have half of that, this many blue dots. You go to the year 2024, and we have half of that amount. The rule of thumb is that material has to be allowed to decay through about 10 half-lives in order to be safe. Now, some people will tell you 20 half-lives, some are around 10 to 20 half-lives. This compound has been allowed to decay, and it's no longer going to pose a threat to humans or to other organisms, insects, fish, reptiles, mammals in the ecosystem. And so the rule of thumb for radioactive material is that after 10 half-lives for this material have been allowed to occur, that the activity has decayed sufficiently to allow you to dispose of it safely. An example is plutonium-239. This is manufactured from uranium. We use it in the production of nuclear weapons. It has a half-life of 24,000 years, and so we have to store this material for 10 half-lives or 240,000 years before it no longer poses a threat to the ecosystem or other humans, using this general rule of thumb. Some people may tell you that 20 years. But it doesn't really matter. When we think about 240,000 years, we can't even think back in history 240,000 years. We probably can't even think back in history a decade or a century. So it's very hard for us to comprehend and understand how we can have some of these compounds that are going to persist in the environment for such long periods of time. What are we going to do with them? How are we going to make sure that they don't get out into the environment where they're going to pose a threat to the ecosystem and ultimately to humans? PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, these are persistent pollutants. They have half-lives of decades, And so they're persisting in the environment. That's why you're exposed to them today. We no longer use PCBs in the United States. We stopped using them decades ago, but you're still exposed to them. They're still in your fatty tissue. They're still in the Great Lakes. They're still in the sediment out there in the Hudson River. We're still exposed to this because they don't break down. They persist. When you do ingest them and they come into your body, they're incorporated in your fatty tissue. It is a hydrophobic molecule, and so it can go right through your cell and lipid membranes, and it can go right to your DNA. This is a double helix of DNA. If we blow up this little center part here, this is the center of that DNA molecule. And all these ring structures here are hydrophobic parts of the molecule. That's why they're in the center. They don't want to be exposed to water that's going to be out here on the outside that can form hydrogen bonds with these oxygens here. And so PCB, when you ingest it eating that fish, it goes and squirms its way right in here into the DNA. And we all know DNA's purpose is to serve as a genetic blueprint, a roadmap to our development, and it's a roadmap for the development and reproductive success for all organisms on planet Earth. And so when you have a man-made compound that comes in here and intercalates into our DNA, it can cause a lot of problems in turning genes on and off, making our DNA machinery behave or misbehave in a way that's going to lead to cancer, that's going to lead to developmental problems, that's going to lead to a lot of other significant health risks that we don't want as humans. This is an example of where PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, are a major problem in the United States. This is taken in May of 2009 from the New York Times. Here is New York City. This is New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont. Here is the Hudson River. The Hudson River is, in this area, highly contaminated, shown in red here, in orange, with polychlorinated biphenyl. The reason it's contaminated with this in this area is because factories, General Electric factories, for decades, for at least 30 years, had been using and manufacturing PCBs. An estimated 1.3 million pounds of polychlorinated biphenyls actually flowed into the Hudson River. And it actually exists in the sediment layers of the river. That's where it has accumulated over time. And so there are efforts right now, very expensive efforts. It's going to cost the U.S. taxpayer about $750 million at the Hudson Superfund site. And it's going to take an estimated 30 years to dig up these sediments that have the PCBs in it, to load them onto barges, and then to take them to where they can be stored for 100 years, 200 years, to allow this material to decay through its half-lives until it no longer poses a threat. General Electric does, again, they do a lot of great things for us. General Electric is responsible for about 50 active Superfund sites right now. During World War II and after World War II, a lot of the products that were manufactured in many of our big companies, we didn't understand the health effects. We allowed them to flow right out into our rivers, lakes, and streams, and now you and I are dealing with those cleanup efforts. So great, we dig this up. What do we do with it? It's very toxic. We can't burn it up. We can't wave our magic wands and make it disappear. We can't really do anything to make it disappear. So what we do is we actually ship it to landfills where this material will be stored. And so the toxic mud and sediment from the Hudson River is actually heading to New Mexico and Texas. Right here is Eunice, New Mexico. This means jobs for these areas. This part of New Mexico, actually, many of the residents welcome this PCB waste because they have these landfills here. These landfills are lined with plastics, and that material is taken out of the Hudson River. It's brought to these landfills, and this is where it is dumped. Some residents don't want this waste because they feel that it's too close to the Ogallala aquifer that is located right in here, and they don't want the potential to this being leaching through these plastics, getting down into the aquifer, because once it's in the aquifer, there's no way to get this out. And so, this is our solution to many of our persistent pollutants. We dig it up, take it from where it is now, where it was mismanaged during the 1940s and 50s and 60s, or whatever it was. We dig this material up, taxpayers pay for that, it's costing hundreds of millions of dollars, and we take it to these special landfills, and that's where we're going to store it for forever. And it also means that there's jobs at these places for long periods of time, because you're going to have to dump these materials, and then you're going to have a secure perimeter to make sure people can't come on and off this property to dig it up. You're going to have to make sure that you have wells in place that are monitoring the migration of these compounds. Do you have holes? You have an earthquake, you got a new fissure. Is this material going to get down into that aquifer? Is it going to migrate into lakes, rivers, and streams? And so it's a real concern to some of these people in this area. So it means jobs, it means waste. Some people like it, some people don't like it, but it's what we have to deal with. PCBs are a major problem for Puget Sound, Washington, and British Columbia. This is Seattle, Washington. British Columbia is right here. If we blow up this area, here's our Pacific Ocean. Pacific Ocean comes in here, and here is Puget Sound, Olympia, Seattle, and there are large populations of orcas, killer whales, in this area. They are mammals, just like us. The physiology, the anatomy, the biochemistry is extremely similar to humans. This is downtown Seattle, beautiful place, just like Grey's Anatomy. Beautiful Mount Rainier right here. So on one side you have beautiful forest, mountains, volcanoes, and on the other side you have Puget Sound, where the orca whale population lives. Dirty little secret here is that many of these industrial areas throughout here have been contaminated with PCBs from 30s, 40s, 50s. We no longer use PCBs today in the United States, but because they have such long half-lives, it is being leached out through water and gravity into Puget Sound, and the orca whale population is being exposed to this compound. I want you to watch this part of PBS Frontline's documentary, Poisoned Waters. This part documents PCBs in the orca whale population in Puget Sound of Washington in British Columbia. There's going to be several scientists, Dr. Peter Ross from the U.S. Department of Fisheries and Oceans, in Canada. And what you're going to hear from here is that PCBs are all over the place. They're a persistent pollutant for Seattle, but also for Columbus, Ohio, also for other parts of the world. They accumulate up food webs, and the levels of PCBs in these orca populations have drastically increased over the last several decades. PCBs may perhaps be the #1 persistent contaminant anywhere in the world, in the northern hemisphere at least. They bioaccumulate in food webs, meaning they build up in toxic levels and cause all sorts of serious health concerns, and we can't get rid of them. Once they get in our fatty tissue, it's extremely difficult to get them out of that fatty tissue. And so this is going to look at that accumulation in orca whale populations, and you're going to see that it specifically is affecting individuals in those populations more than others. Infant whales are bearing the brunt of this problem. They're being exposed to extremely high concentrations of PCBs in their mother's breast milk. These are mammals. They breastfeed for months, if not years. And so you're having many young orcas dying before their first birthday because they're being exposed to toxic, extremely high levels of this in their breast milk of their mother, and it's leading to problems. And so these are very serious concerns for these individuals. But what's happening in the orca's body is the same thing that's happening in the humans of Seattle, the same things are happening in the other humans here and around the Great Lakes and elsewhere around the world. As you're exposed to these pollutants, they're going to have disastrous consequences on our health.
Puget Sound. It's one of America's great coastal estuaries, and it is in peril.
I would put Puget Sound in the intensive care unit. The situation is critical.
You can't let it continue to deteriorate without paying a real price later on.
3 decades after the Clean Water Act, Frontline takes a hard look at why we've failed for so long to clean up Puget Sound.
This is sick. Doesn't look sick, but it is sick. It's like a cancer that's growing.
In a special report, Frontline correspondent Hedrick Smith uncovers the danger to Puget Sound, tracking historic pollution.
Puget Sound is contaminated because PCBs were heavily used by municipalities, by industry, by the military.
Probing new threats.
We put in about 150,000 pounds a day of untreated toxics into Puget Sound.
Following king salmon.
Nobody can make a living anymore out of strictly salmon.
These people exterminated their resource, and now I'm the guy who's to blame.
And discovering the ultimate problem.
It's about the way we all live, and unfortunately, we are all polluters.
People say, your generation, you lost it. You weren't willing to step up and save it.
Tonight on Frontline, investigating what's poisoning Puget Sound.
Puget Sound, one of America's great natural wonders. Overwhelming in its sheer beauty, its stunning vistas, its vast majesty. It's a place I've come to know in recent years and to cherish as a phenomenal resource. A gorgeous natural playground, gateway to the Pacific, and historically a treasure house of fish and wildlife.
Puget Sound is an economic engine for this region. So yes, it's about tourism, and yes, it's about fisheries, but it's also about the fundamental quality of life that we all enjoy here.
Its economic and environmental significance transcends the region. It's a global asset, I think. These sort of estuaries, large estuaries, are the most productive environmental places in the world. And this is one of the biggest, historically one of the most productive.
But today the Sound is in peril.
I would put Puget Sound in the intensive care unit. The situation is critical. We've known for decades that Puget Sound had serious issues, but we're at a point now where the species that are almost extinct are telling us we've got some real bottom line problems here.
Take these regional icons, the killer whales or orcas. They're a major tourist attraction, but increasingly Puget Sound orcas are being closely studied by scientists as a barometer of the health of the entire Puget Sound. To see what scientists are learning, I headed out with Brad Hansen, a team leader with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Up over there. Yep.
Hansen and his colleagues have been tracking and sampling the orca population for several years.
Why study these whales?
Well, they're the top predator in the food chain, so they're essentially accumulating all the contaminants. They're the last stop in the food chain, and so
They're a laboratory, in a way.
Well,
I mean, they're a laboratory that tells you what's going on in the whole ecosystem.
yes, yeah.
The orca story is troubling. Last year, 7 local orcas died. Their population is now down to 85, so low that 3 years ago NOAA declared Puget Sound orcas an endangered species. To figure out why the orca population is in decline, Hansen's team goes out after biological samples.
You're going to get up pretty close to these whales in order to take samples at some point, right?
Get within just 4 or 5 meters.
4 or 5 meters, so that's
Yep.
up close.
Yep.
They shoot darts into the orcas and extract small samples of blubber. That blubber is sent to the lab to be tested for a slew of contaminants, especially telltale toxins like PCBs. The lab results have been alarming.
Our research over the last 10 to 13 years has been able to demonstrate that these killer whales are the most PCB-contaminated marine mammals in the world. So we're very, very concerned about what that might mean to their health.
PCBs are cancer-causing chemicals so toxic that Congress banned them 3 decades ago. But they keep showing up.
PCBs are probably the #1 persistent contaminant of concern anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. They bioaccumulate in food webs.
You mean they build up?
They build up in food webs and in organisms. We have trouble getting rid of them. We have a lot of trouble getting them out of our system. When I say we, I mean humans, rats, killer whales, harbor seals, doesn't really matter.
PCBs are a problem not just for orca whales.
And these animals are eating wild fish. Wild fish is good for us too. But if there's contaminants in it, it's going to have an adverse impact on us. So, that's the thing, is that's why these animals are important sentinel species, not just for the ecosystem in general, but also for humans.
At the Whale Research Center, Director Ken Balcom has been keeping records for 3 decades on the whales that make Puget Sound their regular home.
Fewer whales are making it to maturity. The population is declining. We are seeing probably the next 20 years we'll be witnessing the departure of this population.
You think they're gone? They're going to die out?
I've already told our government folks that we can go through this for about 20 more years if we don't provide a remedy, and we will see the end of this population.
Balcom and his staff know these whales so well by sight that they can track them from birth to death.
So what's this? What are these charts?
These are the family trees of all the whales we've been studying for the past 32 years.
The tombstone markers, Balcom told me, underscore a worrisome trend among the youngest, most vulnerable orcas.
Mothers and babies.
You get these older whales up here. They died. That's kind of normal. But to have so many down here, these younger whales dying, is that a bad sign?
That's the distressing part, is the mortality pattern we're seeing now, is that young whales are dying way before they even mature.
So
Balcom is alarmed at the high levels of PCBs that Hansen's team found in younger whales, which absorb the toxins from their mother's milk.
In the last 2 or 3 years, my reaction has been astonishment that the levels of toxins are rising so rapidly.
Are there enough parallels between the way the human body works, the chemistry and biology of the human body, and the whales, so that we can actually take lessons from them?
Yes, we can take lessons from not only the whales, but the seals and the fish. And it's been demonstrated in the health statistics in especially Arctic environments, cold environments where there's a high-fat diet. The children of these high Arctic people are suffering these same problems: immune deficiencies, reproductive problems, nervous disorders, attention deficits. All of these things are affecting humans as well as the other mammals.
Okay, those are the Samish fish.
Like humans, orca whales like to eat king salmon, known locally as Chinook. So scientists at this NOAA testing lab are studying just how badly PCBs have contaminated the Puget Sound food web. Sandy O'Neill and her team are measuring PCB levels in Chinook salmon.
Hi, Hedrick.
Hey, Sandy, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Good to see you. So tell me, what's going on here?
Well, these are fish that are going to be analyzed for contaminants. So you want to know what levels are in the fish that killer whales are eating.
This is like salmon hamburger meat, which you then sample.
Exactly. It's basically a salmon burger for a whale.
What do you find out about the Puget Sound king salmon? How contaminated are they?
In general, Puget Sound salmon, Chinook salmon, are about 3 to 5 times more contaminated with PCBs than other salmon populations along the west coast that we've sampled.
Everything we see points to Puget Sound being a hotspot for PCBs and a persistent problem. We've seen contamination of animals. We've seen no improvement in the levels of PCBs in the last 20-odd years, despite regulations implemented in the 1970s. And that, to me, indicates there are continuous inputs from land-based sources, from the sediments, and delivering them right into that food web.
One big reason PCBs are a persistent problem is that it takes so long to clean up places like the Duwamish River, Seattle's industrial corridor. Some of Seattle's heaviest industries settled here decades ago, and today it's the region's largest hotspot for PCBs.
My name is B.J. Cummings. I represent the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition. We're a community...
B.J. Cummings leads tours of the river, but this isn't your typical tourist outing. It's an environmental wake-up call.
The EPA did an investigation here on the Duwamish River about 10 years ago and concluded that the industrial history here had left behind such a legacy of toxic pollution that the river was declared a federal Superfund site in 2001.
Superfund is one of EPA's big sticks. It was the regulatory program created in 1980 to clean up America's worst pollution problems.
Your typical Superfund site used to be factory, pipe, Superfund site, right at the bottom of your pipe. That's not what we have here. We have what's called a mega site. We have a 5.5 mile stretch of river, end to end, that's being investigated for cleanup. This is one of the largest Superfund sites in the country. The river was listed as a Superfund site because of an accumulation, a legacy of toxic pollution that has built up in the mud at the bottom of the river.
There's a direct link between contaminated sediments in certain areas and contamination of the food web above those sediments. In fact, one might even think of the PCBs riding an elevator up from the sediments, up into plankton, up into little fish, big fish, harbor seals, killer whales, eagles, humans.
The toxic buildup in the Duwamish River bottom is the product of more than a half-century of industrial development along the river. Boeing, for example, the area's biggest corporation, had its main operations here during World War II.
We are the builders. We are the builders of the B-17. With our hands 1,000,000 strong, we milled and drilled and sheared and saw.
The success of Boeing mirrored the 20th century boom in the American economy, an era when industrial progress brought unprecedented expansion.
Ours are the hands that build the Queen, the B-17, the fortress.
But that progress also left behind an unprecedented amount of pollution, or what's called legacy pollutants.
The term legacy pollutants is when it's historical practices. What was acceptable in the 40s and 50s is we would find very unobjectionable today in the 90s and the 80s and beyond. People did not know the damage that some of these materials caused at the time. They did not know the long-term effects of them that we do today.
PCBs are a classic legacy pollutant found here at Boeing, a toxic chemical once widely used by industry, often as a high-stress lubricant in power stations and also in building materials. Frequently, it takes a lot of detective work to find hidden PCBs.
So, Steve, you found a contamination problem in the flight line out here?
Yeah, it's this material that we see between the concrete panels. It's called joint compound. Material that was installed in the late 60s contained very high levels of PCBs. And since we'd made this discovery, in the late 90s, we've now removed about 50 miles of this throughout.
50 miles?
Throughout all Boeing.
Of this black tar-looking stuff?
Yeah, of this material throughout all of the Boeing facilities here in the Northwest.
Is that right? Why was it so hard to find?
Well, it wasn't obvious to us, and it was, normally when people talk about PCBs, you think about electrical equipment, you think about hydraulics. That's where normally PCBs are used. The fact that they were used in something that was right in front of us was difficult. It was really difficult that we overlooked it.
Making sure that Boeing doesn't overlook any of its legacy pollutants is the job of Sean Blocker, a former Marine who has been EPA's point man on the cleanup at Boeing.
What I want to talk about today is basically some additional data that we have that's on the sediments outside the current boundary of the cleanup for the Boeing Plant 2. And the significance of the Boeing facility is the number of contaminants that originate from the facility. It has over 24 things in the groundwater, 40 some odd different things that are in the soil that are above cleanup levels. So it's the biggest accumulation of contaminants in that area.
From the get-go, Boeing and EPA have clashed over how to clean up those legacy pollutants, and the arguments have led to long delays.
When were you first ready to go with a cleanup plan?
We submitted a plan to EPA in 1999 when, to dredge, we call it an interim measure to take what is adjacent to Boeing and excavate that material.
Boeing says that over a decade ago, it was ready to clean up, and all that held it up was bureaucratic red tape from the EPA.
I would disagree with that. From my review of what they were going to do, I didn't think they had fully defined where all the bad stuff was. They didn't know the totality of what the contamination was, either in groundwater or soil.
But you obviously had a higher threshold for let's get to the bottom of how bad this pollution is than Boeing did.
Boeing is doing what they're asked to do. No more, no less.
So time and again, Blocker pressed Boeing to do more work and more tests. By now, Boeing has spent $80 million on testing and interim cleanups.
There's over 500 sampling locations at this facility that have been drilled over time.
And if we came here 10 years ago, how many would there have been?
50.
Okay, so hundreds more have been drilled
Since
because
then.
of this back and forth with the EPA.
That's correct.
Not only has Boeing been feuding with the EPA, but it's been locked in a fierce battle with the city of Seattle, which used to operate a steam plant next door to Boeing Field. Typical of Superfund sites, these two powerful neighbors have been wrangling over who's responsible for PCBs flowing through this ditch or flume when it rains. The flume runs from the now-defunct steam plant through Boeing's territory to the river. Boeing says it's the city's PCBs.
So was this just the city steam plant, or did Boeing and other people put storm drains into this and use it?
Pretty much it was just for the cooling water from the steam plant.
The city flat out disagrees, and it has taken Boeing to court.
PCBs are coming by connections of other people to our ditch. They come through drainage lines that come from other properties, most specifically Boeing's property.
So Boeing was attaching its drainage pipes to your flume, sending some of its dirty stuff down your flume to the river.
There have been over 20 lines attached to our ditch that came from the Boeing property.
20 lines?
Yeah.
So it's got to be an endless argument with Boeing over whose line put the dirty stuff in that flume.
It's a continuing argument.
And that argument is holding up the big cleanup on the Duwamish River. Jay Manning, who heads Washington's Department of Ecology, which helps EPA supervise the cleanup, showed me the cost of this continued delay to Puget Sound.
We're looking at 4 very large outfalls of drainage pipes that carry stormwater from more than 30 square miles of this area. You can see the one there to the right.
So this is an industrial dumping ground, in effect.
This stormwater drains a very large industrial area.
Are you all still finding PCBs and other contaminants in that water?
Unfortunately, the stormwater coming out of those drain pipes, we're still detecting PCBs.
This is going to cost millions to clean up, maybe tens of millions. And owning 90% of that liability is not a place you want to be. So these folks, who are not stupid, are busy trying to prove that it's somebody other than them that are the source.
Everybody's pointing the finger at everybody else.
And they are trying to prove, probably not that they have no liability, because that's pretty hard to do, but proving that they have very little compared to their neighbor. That's what it's about, and it's about money.
Ultimately, the issues of cleanup, time, and money are tied to a larger question for all of us. That is, how clean do we expect our waterways to be? Here on the Duwamish, the state has posted warnings not to eat local fish and shellfish because of pollution. And so the fight now is over whether the river can be cleaned up enough to let the locals fish the river once again without risk.
What we determined was that the most sensitive population we had out there were our Native Americans that eat the fish out of the Duwamish.
And they eat a lot more fish than most of us.
They do.
And so that was the standard you wanted to set. Clean it up so the tribes can eat the fish safely without getting poisoned from PCBs.
Yes.
Okay. And Boeing objected to that?
Basically, they don't feel that that stretch of the river can ever be returned to where you could harvest these kind of fish and shellfish. We disagree with that.
I think people need to understand is that there are going to be certain uses of the Duwamish River that aren't going to be possible in the future. And I'll give you an example. I don't think people are going to be able to subsistence fish out of the species that are in the Duwamish. I think we have to set reasonable expectations for cleanup in industrial areas.
I mean, where do you come down on that? How clean is clean? I mean, do we need to get rivers back to where people can fish and safely eat the fish without fear to their health?
That's the goal. That is the goal. That has to be the goal. Because every one of those rivers and streams are going into Puget Sound, so it's not as if it's about that river or that stream alone. It's about the whole ecosystem.
Just across the river from Boeing, the threat of legacy pollution and the question of how clean is clean became personal. Right here in South Park, where in 2004 the community was rocked by news that some of its streets and people's yards were contaminated with PCBs.
People in South Park, particularly people with families with small children, got incredibly nervous. I mean, out and out scared about what this might mean. I push my kid's stroller down that street every day. You know, I go down there and I fish. My dog runs along that waterfront. You know, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my health?
I mean, you try to do the best for your kids, and all of a sudden something like this comes, and it feels so scary what you're saying.
She's talking about PCBs, cancer-causing microbes banned in the 70s, but taking an emotional toll on the residents of South Park today.
The city of Seattle realized it had a crisis and moved quickly to pave the contaminated streets, clean up the polluted yards, and tell people how to take safety precautions. Suddenly, South Park, a largely immigrant working-class neighborhood surrounded by industry, was galvanized into action. Residents demanded a long-promised cleanup of an abandoned industrial site called Malarkey Asphalt.
Malarkey Asphalt for years operated directly across the street from homes in South Park and was a really, really dirty business. For many years, there was open dumping on the riverbank. There was waste oil that was sprayed in the area to keep the dust on the unpaved streets down, and that contaminated the roads and yards right in people's gardens around the property.
Years earlier, the old Malarkey site had been bought by the Port of Seattle, which did a PCB cleanup on part of Malarkey's property. But people in South Park suspected there were still many more undiscovered PCB hotspots upland from the riverbank at Malarkey.
So the neighborhood said, go take some tests there. Tell us what's there. EPA and the port said, oh, no, we did the upland. It's finished. We eventually were able to succeed in getting just a few more tests. Just assure us. Show us it's okay.
We were finding numbers that were higher than any of the
Doug Hotchkiss, the port's manager for the Malarkey site, ran tests, and what he found surprised everyone.
What was the hottest spot you found? How high was it?
The hottest spot for PCBs was right in this area here, and it was about 9,000 parts per million.
9,000, and the federal limit is 25. I mean, this is a really hot spot.
Yeah, and luckily it was under asphalt, but it was still something that even under asphalt you couldn't just leave there.
So Hotchkiss drafted a plan to clean up Malarkey, but it backfired.
We would be cleaning up to 25 parts per million, which was the cleanup level that EPA had accepted before.
And how did the community take that? How did they react?
They were not happy with it. They didn't find it acceptable.
In fact, South Park was up in arms, insisting on a cleanup to the residential standard of 1 part per million.
Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition, residents from South Park, started calling up port commissioners and explaining the problem to them. They got in vans and buses and went down where the Port Commission was meeting, and one after another got up and told the Port Commission that they were worried about their health and that the Port Commission had the responsibility to the community to make sure that that cleanup would be safe for the entire community to use.
Well, it was a very emotionally charged meeting. I wouldn't necessarily say it was confrontational, but it was a lot of emotion in the room. And I remember a particular episode where a young mother came up to the stand and said, you know, if it's only a question of money, how can you forsake the children of South Park? And that was something that really hit home to me.
So the elected port commissioners, sensitive to public opinion, backed down. They adopted the more protective residential standard at twice the cost.
I think that this effort has been successful because this community has been uncompromising in speaking up for itself and in insisting that people listen. We essentially have a community here that has been on the fringes of any kind of economic or political power in the city of Seattle for many decades. So it's a community that has only recently kind of refound its voice.
By finding its voice, South Park redefined the meaning of clean. And the community is now at work developing riverfront habitat zones at Malarkey and elsewhere along the Duwamish.
In the absence of a B.J. Cummings or somebody like her who is out there on the water, knowledgeable, aware of what's happening, and poking and prodding and asking us the hard questions, we would not be making the progress that we're making.
Moving around Puget Sound, I learned that we've played havoc with our waterways and decimated wildlife, not just by dumping toxic chemicals, but by massively disrupting the normal workings and biorhythms of Mother Nature. Like PCBs in the Duwamish River, most man-made intrusions are legacies of the past, unintended consequences of economic growth. I saw the impact of the human footprint up close here in the Skagit River Delta, about 80 miles north of Seattle.
We can fish from here way up the Skagit, but we just choose to fish in this location because it's a nice long drift.
Brian Clattersby is chairman of the Swinomish Indian tribe. Every fall, he and his tribal members head out on the Skagit River, the biggest source of salmon in all of Puget Sound. For generations, even centuries, the Swinomish and other tribes have depended on salmon fishing for their livelihoods.
I guess the salmon to us was like the buffalo to the natives in the Midwest and the Great Plains. It is something that God has put here for us to allow us to sustain ourselves.
Clattersby's problem is that the salmon here have gone the way of the buffalo. King salmon are now down to only about 5 to 10% of historic levels. They're officially listed as endangered.
Nobody can make a living anymore out of strictly salmon. It's just not possible. And so there is nobody in our tribe anymore just focusing on salmon and making a living like we used to. It just doesn't happen.
The salmon here, according to the tribe and state scientists, are victims of economic development along the Skagit. Logging, hydroelectric dams, and agriculture, which have wiped out much of the habitat that salmon need to spawn and grow.
If you took a map of the Skagit before the white man came here in the 1850s and you see where the salmon used to go, you would be surprised how many stream miles they had here on the Skagit. That's why the Skagit was able to produce millions and millions and millions of fish. When the non-Indians came, they basically diked and cut off all that habitat.
When settlers arrived in the mid-1800s, the Skagit Delta was a tidal plain flooded daily by the sea. But through ingenuity and hard work, the settlers built an extensive system of dikes as a seawall and turned the water-soaked silt into incredibly productive farmland.
What many people don't realize is this is a subtidal valley. Think Holland. There would be 30,000 of these acres that we're standing on, including where we're standing right here, that would be underwater at high tide were it not for the dikes.
So the dikes are keeping the salt water out.
Keep the salt water off of the delta.
The Johnson family has been farming the Delta for 5 generations, and regulating water in the subtidal Skagit Delta is vital to their farms. That's managed by tide gates that let floodwater from rains get out to sea and block saltwater from coming in and ruining their crops.
That is the way the system operates. And the tide gate itself is the heart and soul of this thing.
You've got dikes running north and south along this coastline for, I don't know, 10, 15, 20, 30 miles?
Yeah,
like
probably. The whole system in the Skagit County has 140 tide gates. That's a lot of tide gates.
Those tide gates have become the flashpoint of a battle royal. The tribes want to recover 3,000 acres of lost salmon habitat. They argue that tide gates block salmon from going upstream to their natural habitat, and they want them removed. Skagit farmers balk at giving up their land or their tide gates. I got an earful from Curtis Johnson and his brothers about the salmon problem, which they say was caused by the Indians themselves.
The salmon have declined simply because they kill them faster than they can reproduce.
So you're saying the problem is overfishing, it's not estuary, it's not diking.
Absolutely. These people exterminated their resource. And now I'm the bad guy. I'm the guy who's to blame. Why in the hell don't I quit farming and let them use my land to raise fish on?
These people that work for the tribes, I believe that behind every picture over there in the office is a sign that says "Get Whitey," and that's their mantra.
Yeah, they're
Indian lovers. They got screwed. We're going to save them.
Yeah.
To hell with the farmers and the farming.
To hell with everybody. They got screwed in 1870 at Little Bighorn or wherever it was. I wasn't there. I didn't do it. Hell, when my great-grandpa came here, nobody said, don't farm this land. It's fish country.
What we're seeing here is a collision of two cultures, a collision of two industries, if you will, a collision of two ways of life.
Two natural resource industries are on a collision course.
This cultural and economic collision landed in court. The tribe filed suit to remove tidal gates in one of the seawall dikes to recover old salmon habitat. A federal judge ruled firmly in favor of the tribe, pushing the two sides to strike a limited deal that will be tricky to carry out. But prospects are dim for negotiating a wider settlement.
I mean, if you're going to negotiate with somebody, there's got to be trust, doesn't there? I mean, if you're going to do it, I mean, is trust a problem?
It is. It is not easy, and I think you nailed it when you said trust. I mean, there's not too much trust right now.
Is there any trust left? It sounds like you don't trust them and they don't trust you.
There is no trust between me and them. None. Zero.
Entrenched economic interests can seem immovable, but 150 miles south of Skagit, along the Nisqually River, I learned that resolving our pollution problems can be achieved by individual initiative and cooperation among feuding parties like tribes and farmers. On the Nisqually, I caught up with two local leaders who'd been on opposing sides. Tribal elder Billy Frank and Jim Wilcox, a large farm owner.
You're the guy that's responsible.
Like the Skagit up north, this river was disrupted by logging, dams, and large farming operations, and the salmon population was decimated. Billy Frank had grown up fighting for Indian fishing rights, protesting that the white establishment was blocking the Indians from getting their fair share of the fish.
They didn't want no Indians catching any of their fish. And so that was what the fight was all about. And we took it to them. We took it to them. We, went to jail over 50, 80 times.
Finding common ground with the tribes to restore the river and its salmon didn't come naturally to farmers like Jim Wilcox, who ran a huge $300 million dairy farm on the Nisqually.
I went to school with a lot of members of the Nisqually tribe. We also employed Native Americans, and they were good workers. But kind of the prevailing attitude was that most of the Indians were beset by alcohol problems, that you couldn't depend on them, that they never would keep an appointment. And those were just kind of the stereotypes that I can recall that almost everybody sort of had.
A 1974 landmark federal court decision by Judge George Bolt upheld the Indian fishing rights. Billy Frank started pushing to force the area's economic stakeholders into a negotiation over how best to protect the river. The state set up the Nisqually Task Force, but there was little trust and prospects for success were poor.
When the Nisqually River Task Force was formed, what did you think? What was your reaction?
I was scared out of my wits.
Because?
Well, I didn't think anything good could come out of it in terms of how it would affect me. I was a farmer, and I just wanted to keep farming, and I considered that the task force would come up with just a lot more regulations that would make it even more difficult for me to continue farming and ultimately force me out.
So why did you take part in the Nisqually River Task Force?
Out of a feeling of fear that I had to be an advocate for our farm. There was a kind of a coalition that we ultimately formed in the beginning of landowners and timber companies and farmers.
Weyerhaeuser, one of them?
Yes.
And the coalition was intended to do what?
Block anything that the task force could come up with.
You know, they tried to kill the task force, and I mean, this was you could, when you walk into a situation like that, it's not good, because you know the air is not good, and people are over in the corners figuring out what their next move is.
After many confrontational meetings, the task force was deadlocked. Then Billy Frank made a surprise move.
Never forget the night. I think it was a particularly stormy session. Everybody was emotional. The tempers flared, and Billy Frank got up. As I say, I'll never forget this. And he said, we've got to stop this right now. He said, I want everybody to know that we want Weyerhaeuser Timber Company to continue to operate and own land along the river. We want Wilcox Farms to keep farming. We don't want to do anything that's going to put them out of business. We want other farmers to stay along the river.
I never gave up on any of these people. I never gave up on Jim or any of our leaders up and down the watershed. I said, you know, we have to be together.
I recognize that this was a turning point, and that we could probably complete the process in a spirit of cooperation. At least I hope that's what could happen.
Boy, that's just...
With a new foundation of trust, the deadlock broke. And in time, the task force, supported by state funding but driven by local leadership, developed a restoration plan for the Nisqually, negotiating buffer zones along the riverbanks.
Oh, it's a Chinook.
Yeah.
To help restock the river with salmon, Fort Lewis provided the tribe with land for a fish hatchery, land historically owned by the tribe. Congress provided funds to build the hatchery, and Tacoma Power put up money to run it. But getting tidal wetlands back was the key. Billy Frank found a few farmers willing to sell choice land to the tribe. The tribe tore down the dikes and flooded the land with seawater.
The dikes are already open. The water goes right up to the freeway behind us here. So this is an estuary. The tide comes in, and there's little salmon fishing, swimming all over here.
So in the 20 years or more since the Nisqually Task Force was set up, can you see improvements
Yes.
in the river, in the wildlife, in the salmon coming back?
Yes, absolutely. The eagles, the habitat, the beavers are coming back. The little animals that lived on this watershed, they're coming back. You know, these are very important life on the estuary and the ecosystem of a watershed. Well, James, is this James? God dang it, James. Boy, oh boy. Long time no see.
At the annual Nisqually Salmon Festival, the old rivals celebrate the restoration of the river and its salmon.
We got a lot more in common
than
we have on the other side.
When we have our auction, it's always for the river.
The Nisqually story is an object lesson that repairing the damage that we humans have done to Mother Nature requires taking responsibility and finding common ground.
But what we really need to do is sort of reinstitute a Jeffersonian barn-raising kind of philosophy about people who are living in an ecosystem that has been taken care of for many decades, often by them, and figure out what's wrong here, what's the problem, what do we need to do to solve it. And once they decide that, and once they decide they're going to bring everybody else in that area together to try to solve it with them, it just breaks all kinds of barriers, and all kinds of things can happen that are good.
The greatest threats to our waterways are often invisible to the naked eye. Evidence crops up in unlikely places, like Alki Beach across Elliott Bay from downtown Seattle. It's a favorite spot for scuba divers, but taking to the water here isn't for the faint of heart. Temperatures in the Puget can be in the 40s. But for the adventurous, underwater exploration offers a unique perspective on the marine environment.
Today we saw a giant Pacific octopus underneath the Honey Bear, which is a little boat that sunk out here. It lives underneath the bow of the boat.
It also provides a close-up view of the hidden threat to Puget Sound, like this drainage pipe, one of the main outfalls for Seattle's rainwater runoff.
We swam by the end of the stormwater drain, and it's pretty dramatic. The end of the pipe creates a brown, noxious soup of nastiness that is unbelievable and kind of dramatic and a little bit scary.
Unbelievable because the water looks so good from up here. So we're looking at something we think is clean, and underneath you can see, diving there, it's dirty.
It's not clean.
It's dirty.
It's not clean. When we see that thing running in full flow, we turn around and we swim the other way quickly. There is just this unbelievable
gunk
coming out of the end of this pipe. This is our front yard. Would you allow your front yard to be sick?
This is sick.
This is sick. Doesn't look sick, but it is sick.
What's making this water so sick is what scientists have now labeled the #1 menace to our waterways: stormwater runoff. In Seattle, peak time for stormwater runoff is during fall and winter, when the rain comes down in torrents.
Everywhere that rain falls and hits the ground, it's going to pick up something. It might be nothing more hazardous than dirt, or it might be PCBs. It might be some toxic pesticide, and it will travel along with the water into the nearest drainage ditch, into the nearest swale, into a creek, into a river, and ultimately into Puget Sound. And whatever pollutants that water picks up on its journey to Puget Sound, it's going to deposit in Puget Sound.
We put in about 150,000 pounds a day of untreated toxics into Puget Sound. We thought all the way along that it was like a toilet, to be honest with you. What you put in, you flush out, and it goes out to the ocean, it gets diluted. We know that's not true. It's like a bathtub. So what you put in stays there.
The pollution in stormwater runoff in major cities like Seattle or in suburban and urban areas across the country is massive. Yet until recently, it was little controlled. The original Clean Water Act didn't regulate stormwater at all, though some limits have been adopted since. But the problem remains poorly understood because so much of the pollution is invisible.
People go nuts over a 50-gallon oil spill. It's because you can see it, and it's really nasty looking. When you see it on the water, it is impressive how horrible it looks. And so oil spills aren't invisible. They're highly visible, and they galvanize people like nothing else.
What about the invisible? What about the auto traffic? What kind of, quote, oil spill is there from our ordinary living?
Based on actual sampling in the Puget Sound Basin, we've estimated that the volume of oil that is carried into Puget Sound by stormwater runoff is equal to the oil spill in Prince William Sound, but the Exxon Valdez spill. Every 2 years, stormwater in Puget Sound carries that volume of oil into Puget Sound.
The heart of the problem is concrete, asphalt, streets, sidewalks, buildings, shopping centers, suburban housing, rooftops, hard surfaces, what scientists call impervious surfaces that block the downpour of rain from naturally sinking into the ground.
How the land is developed, how intensely, will have a direct impact on the quality of stormwater. You take down a forested area and replace it with pavement or a rooftop, and instead of almost all of the water slowly moving through the forest canopy and down to the ground and infiltrating down into groundwater, where it will move slowly, that water, the day it lands, within minutes of it hitting the ground, it's going to be gone.
And so scientists, environmentalists, and regulators all say that combating pollution is not just a matter of regulating industry, but the key to stormwater runoff is land use, how we develop and use our land. King County, I learned, has become a laboratory for testing the politics of land use. It's an area bigger than the state of Rhode Island, home not just to Seattle and 1.8 million people, but 2/3 of it is still forest. So it's an area where environmentalists want to strictly control the pace of development. And the man who has been leading the charge is longtime King County Chief Executive Ron Sims.
You have to protect our forests. You have to, in our agricultural areas. You must. Because if we don't protect them, our water quality will be significantly diminished. And why sacrifice clean water for growth.
Sims says his mission has been to save Puget Sound by protecting critical areas like forests. Way up here, 45 miles east of Seattle, he paid $22 million in tax money to buy development rights on 90,000 acres of forest, meaning that no developer could build on that land.
There won't be 200,000. We have 100. People are going to build their homes here. They were going to have their supermarkets here, their gas stations here. We stopped it, and we stopped it forever.
What does saving this timberland have to do with Puget Sound?
The waters that come off this 90,000 acres flow into the Snoqualmie River, which flows into Lake Washington, which flows into Puget Sound. We need pristine waters coming from this timberland into the Puget Sound. And so this property is absolutely critical to it.
Washington State's Growth Management Act directs local government leaders like Sims to concentrate new growth in cities and to prevent sprawl in lightly populated rural areas. For King County, Sims pioneered a critical areas ordinance that limits just how much forest and woodland property owners can cut down. Sims targets places like this, a 5-acre, one-family plot of land that belongs to Howard and Patty Van Laken.
Back in 2004, King County passed this critical areas ordinance that takes away the usage of 65% of your property if you don't have it cleared off, and we didn't have ours cleared off at the time, so we cannot touch 65% of our property.
So why would you want to clear more than 35% of this wonderful forest?
What we originally planned when we were in 1980 when we bought it was that we could subdivide and maybe give our kids a parcel of land to build a house on, or sell off part of the property for the proceeds to be able to keep our house and retire.
How do you feel about that?
Rather angry.
Very angry. Very angry. It's our property. We have been paying taxes on this property since 1980, and we can't even plant grass.
Angry at whom? Angry at what?
I'm angry with the King County government because they more or less took away our property rights without any compensation for our property.
We're getting the shaft. They're putting the burden on the small landowner, not on everybody.
The Van Laken's problem actually stems from a zoning ordinance passed in the early 1980s that barred subdividing properties under 5 acres. But to many rural landowners, Sims' new ordinance was the last straw, and they formed the Citizens Alliance for Property Rights. I met with several of them one evening over a beer in Issaquah.
We're in the same position that the blacks were in the 1950s. Absolutely. We are calling, we are crying, we are doing everything we can to talk to those who have their hands on the levers, and they aren't listening.
One throbbing refrain was resentment against political domination by the urban majority, which outnumbers rural voters nearly 5 to 1.
We talk about critical areas ordinance like it's a nice little one-page thing. We're talking about over 400 pages of amendments to existing law. 400, over 400 pages.
How much of the frustration out here is a matter not just of a single ordinance, but of a series of regulations that feel onerous? I mean, how much of this is built up over time?
Much of it is built up. It started in '88 with the Sensitive Areas Ordinance. In 2000, we had a gigantic downzoning fight. And then the coup de grace was the 2004 Critical Area Ordinance.
So it's an accumulation of things,
Very
right?
much an accumulation of regulation.
They told me people were so steamed up that Ron Sims rarely dared to come to their part of the county. People on his staff say he's gotten threats.
If it wasn't for us, I bet somebody would have gone for 30-06.
Talking about they would go for 30-06s? Guns?
I'm not saying they would. I'm saying they're terrified. I'm saying there are people who are so angry. If we didn't have a way to direct that to get some results, I know there are people in this county that probably would have shot a few key people. They are so angry.
We have been involved in destroying the timber industry.
Did you get any threats?
I always get threats.
I mean, serious threats?
I always get serious threats.
Do you take them seriously?
I cannot restrict my life and what I do based upon people who are angry and people who wish to threaten me. But in this particular case, it wasn't pleasant. People were yelling at me. We got a lot of nasty phone calls and emails, and it wasn't fun being on television. And quite frankly, I was abandoned by a lot of people, even the environmental community at the time, for saying, Ron, you might be too heavy-handed.
But Sims has not backed down. He asserts that the county ordinance was prompted by scientific analysis of runoff water flows, and he gets solid political backing from an overwhelming majority in King County.
What do you say to critics who say, or to people who say, look, they've taken my land, in effect. I can only use a third of my land, 2/3 of my land, I've got to leave in forest and bushes.
No one has lost the value or use of their land. There's not one case in King County where anybody's been able to show that.
You mean nobody's come forward and said, I want to do this on my property, and you've turned them down?
What people have found is that we're not going to allow them to develop their land in terms of building a lot of homes on it. But the use of their land, they still enjoy it to this day.
The rural people are saying this burden all falls on us. The city people don't have any burden on them. How do you respond?
Well, the city people have far more burdens and restrictions on their land than anyone in a rural area has. Far more. And they have far more regulation on their land.
Folks, stay tuned. This thing with another round on the lawsuit and the enforcement of...
Some angry rural property owners filed suit, and a state appeals court has struck down part of Sims' critical areas ordinance. That issue is now before the state Supreme Court.
If the Supreme Court upholds the Court of Appeals decision, it'll be the abandonment of everything that this state has voted on consistently, which is they want environmental protection here.
While the legal drama plays out, the lesson for Ron Sims is unmistakable.
We will never recover Puget Sound if we don't get a hold of the stormwater. I mean, I never imagined that body of water would just fundamentally be unhealthy for whales and for salmon, for all the things that make it a rich, wonderful environment. We may, in the next couple of decades, and when I'm 80 years old, if we don't do anything, people will say, your generation, you lost it. You weren't willing to step up and save it.
We do have choices to make, and from what I saw and heard on my journey, time is much more urgent and the stakes are much higher than I had once realized.
Our economic well-being ultimately depends on a healthy environment. If we don't take the steps in the world to begin to adjust to man's impact on the environment so that we don't systematically destroy all these natural systems that underpin life itself, that our chances of doing well economically are greatly diminished.
You're suggesting we're on a dangerous track.
You can't let it continue to deteriorate without paying a real price later on.
The danger signs are everywhere. Dead zones, dying young whales, intersex in male fish, the growing risk of serious health problems for humans.
The 70s were a lot about, we're the good guys, we're the environmentalists, we're going to go after the polluters. And it's not really about that anymore. It's about the way we all live. And unfortunately, we are all polluters. I am, you are, all of us are. So it's not a time of going out there and looking for the bad guys and saying, we're going to crack down on you. It's a time of looking at ourselves and the way we live and saying, we're going to have to change some things to make these improvements. And that's hard.
Success is possible, but the lesson driven home to me again and again is that the key is public engagement.
If the public is not engaged, in Puget Sound, for example, we will fail. we will fail. I have no confidence whatsoever we can get the job done unless and until everybody steps up, accepts responsibility, and becomes part of the solution.
You have to change the way you live in the ecosystem, in the place that you share with other living things. You've got to learn to live in such a way that it doesn't destroy those living things. It's got to become part of our culture.
Water pollution has slipped off our radar screen in the face of other seemingly more urgent crises. But pollution is a ticking time bomb. It's a chronic cancer that is slowly eating away natural resources that are vital to our very survival.
The fact that it's in slow motion, or one cut at a time, is one of the hardest things about trying to save the environment. There are so few things, so few insults to the environment that are in and of themselves so massive that everyone would recognize it.
We have not, as a nation, been as attentive as I believe we should have been on our treasures, and we're going to lose them. It's not too late. It's not too late to recover the Chesapeake Bay. It's not too late to recover Puget Sound. But if we continue to believe that time favors us, we will lose them.
There's more to explore on our website, where you can watch the full program again online. Explore what's safe to eat and drink. Find out why it's taking so long to clean up the waterways, what the quality of your water is, and what you can do to help.
You're talking about billions of dollars of economic impact with oysters, crabs, shad, striped
Plus, read the interviews with experts.
Absolutely no oxygen in these dead zones.
These are the modern canary in the mine.
Humans, rats, killer whales, harbor seals, doesn't really matter.
And join the discussion about this program at pbs.org.
It's our failure to control toxic chemicals before they cause trouble in the environment that haunts our waters all across the nation. Places like Puget Sound, which I've come to know well in recent years. The Sound, which lies off the coast of Seattle, is a place I've come to cherish as a phenomenal resource. A gorgeous natural playground, gateway to the Pacific, and historically a treasure house of fish and wildlife. But today, the Sound is in peril.
I would put Puget Sound in the intensive care unit. The situation is critical. We've known for decades that Puget Sound had serious issues, but we're at a point now where the species that are almost extinct are telling us we've got some real bottom line problems here.
Take these regional icons, the killer whales or orcas. They're a major tourist attraction, but increasingly, Puget Sound orcas are being closely studied by scientists as a barometer of the health of the entire sound. To see what scientists are learning, I headed out with Brad Hansen, a team leader with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Up, over there. Yep.
Hansen and his colleagues have been studying the orca population for several years.
Why study these whales?
Well, they're the top predator in the food chain, so they're essentially accumulating all the contaminants. They're the last stop in the food chain, and so
they're a laboratory in a way.
Well,
they're a laboratory that tells you what's going on in the whole ecosystem.
Yes.
The orca story is troubling. In 1 year, 7 local orcas died. Their population is now down to 86, so low that in 2005, NOAA listed Puget Sound orcas as an endangered species. To figure out why the orca population is in decline, Hansen's team goes out after biological samples.
They get up pretty close to these whales in order to take samples at some point, right?
Yeah, we get within just 4 or 5 meters.
4 or 5 meters, so that's up close.
Yep.
They shoot blunt-nosed darts into the orcas and extract small samples of blubber. That blubber is sent to the lab to be tested for a slew of contaminants, especially telltale toxins like PCBs. The lab results have been alarming.
Our research over the last 10 to 13 years has been able to demonstrate that these killer whales are the most PCB-contaminated marine mammals in the world. So we're very, very concerned about what that might mean to their health.
PCBs are cancer-causing chemicals, so toxic that Congress banned them 3 decades ago, but they keep showing up.
PCBs are probably the #1 persistent contaminant of concern anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. They bioaccumulate in food webs.
You mean they build up?
They build up in food webs and in organisms. We have trouble getting rid of them. We have a lot of trouble getting them out of our system. When I say we, I mean humans, rats, killer whales, harbor seals, doesn't really matter.
Increasingly, scientists worry that PCBs are a problem, not just for orca whales.
These animals are eating wild fish. Wild fish is good for us too. But if there's contaminants in it, it's going to have an adverse impact on us. So, that's the thing, is that's why these animals are important sentinel species, not just for the ecosystem in general, but also for humans.
At the Center for Whale Research, Director Ken Balcom has been keeping records for 3 decades on the whales that make Puget Sound their regular home.
Fewer whales are making it to maturity. The population is declining. We are seeing probably the next 20 years we'll be witnessing the departure of this population.
You think they're gone? They're going to die out?
I've already told our government folks that we can go through this for about 20 more years if we don't provide a remedy, and we will see the end of this population.
Okay, Ken, so
Balcom and his staff know these whales so well by sight that they can track them from birth to death.
What are these charts?
These are the family trees of all the whales we've been studying for the past 32 years. We just put in
The tombstone markers, Balcom told me, underscore a worrisome trend among the youngest, most vulnerable orcas.
You get these older whales up here. They died. That's kind of normal. Right. But to have so many down here, these younger whales dying, is that a bad sign?
That's the distressing part, is the mortality pattern we're seeing now, is that young whales are dying way before they even mature.
He's alarmed at the high levels of PCBs that Hansen's team found in younger whales, which absorb PCBs from their mother's milk.
Are there enough parallels between the way the human body works, the chemistry and biology of the human body, and the whales, so that we can actually take lessons from them?
Yes, we can take lessons from not only the whales, but the seals and the fish. And it's been demonstrated in the health statistics in especially Arctic environments, cold environments where there's a high-fat diet. And the children of these high Arctic people are suffering these same problems, immune deficiencies, reproductive problems. All of these are affecting humans as well as the other mammals.
At NOAA testing labs like this one, scientists have established that king salmon in Puget Sound are much more heavily contaminated with PCBs than salmon in other Pacific coastal waters.
Everything we see points to Puget Sound being a hotspot for PCBs and a persistent problem. We've seen contamination of animals. We've seen no improvement in the levels of PCBs in the last 20-odd years, despite regulations implemented in the 1970s. And that, to me, indicates there are continuous inputs from land-based sources, from the sediments, and delivering them right into that food web.
We often need to determine safe levels, exposure levels, and epidemiologists are scientists who try to determine cause and effect for toxins and pathogens. The Center for Disease Control has an epidemic intelligence service. Here's the website right here. And these are really MDs, medical doctors, or PhDs, or maybe they have an MD, PhD. These are detectives. They call boots on the ground disease detectives, where they go out and try to solve outbreaks. For example, the Ebola outbreak. Many of the scientists that were involved in looking at that health problem, trying to work backwards to where did it come from, how was it being spread, and from that we could then limit exposures, identify health problems, and attack that so that we could get that Ebola outbreak under control and prevent it from spreading, which looks like we finally have done. There's a very good movie that looks at these types of scientists. Contagion. It's a movie that came out in 2011. Matt Damon, Lawrence Fishburne, Jude Law, and Kate Winslet are starring in it. And in this, Kate Winslet and Lawrence Fishburne work for the CDCs. They are epidemiologists, and they're trying to back calculate how this contagion, how this virus is being spread in populations of the United States. It is unethical to give or infect a group of humans with a potential toxin, and in fact it's illegal to do that, and determine what its negative side effects are. We have done that in the past. During World War II, Nazi Germany was notorious for doing experiments on people. But we don't do that today. We can't do that today. It's just unethical. It's just not right. And so the epidemiologists have to go back and do detective work. They find people that have the disease, that have the sickness, and they try to work backwards to see where it came from. Once we know where it came from, how it's being spread, we can then prevent it from going any further. They use a lot of mathematics, a lot of statistics to find correlations between a toxin such as bisphenol A and a disease such as chronic heart disease. And so these epidemiologists are an important line of defense to preventing outbreaks like Ebola from getting worse than it is. Again, these are medical doctors, but probably not the ones that you're going to go to when you're sick. They can write you a prescription, but they're largely not going to. These are mainly the people that are out there in the field, in the rainforests in Africa, trying to understand how Ebola is being transmitted from a small rural community to vast infrastructures and roads and pathways leading out of that community to larger urban areas. A recent publication by Ian Lang et al. In the Journal of the American Medical Association, 2008, was published to look at BPA exposure in humans at low-level chronic doses from epoxy resin and lining of food cans and beverage containers. And the subjects were interviewed. Urine samples were collected to determine what concentrations of BPA they had in their urine, and they were asked if they had been diagnosed with various health conditions. The data was adjusted for age, for sex, and statistically analyzed to see if any groups that were exposed and had high concentrations of BPA in their urine experienced adverse health effects. And here are the results that were presented in the Journal of the American Medical Association's publication. Again, they were looking at 5 different health effects: heart disease, coronary heart disease, angina, which basically means a lack of blood flow to the heart muscle, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, liver disease, and stroke. They measured the average concentration of BPA in the subject's urine, and they wanted to know if that person that was tested had any of these diseases. The orange bars here show subjects that had the disease, and the blue bars show subjects that had not been diagnosed with the disease. And so if we zoom in here on those patients that had heart attacks, these are the patients that had not had a heart attack, and these are the concentrations of BPA. They varied from about 3 parts per billion up to 5 parts per billion. And shown here in orange are those patients that had been diagnosed with heart attack. And their concentrations of BPA in their urine were about 4 all the way up to about 8 parts per. And so, those patients where there was a lot of overlap between BPA in the urine of subjects with and without stroke and liver disease, like in this case here and in this case here, BPA was not implicated in causing liver disease or causing stroke. However, in these shown here in blue, you can see the patients that had been diagnosed with diabetes had higher concentrations of BPA than those that did not have diabetes. And so there's very little overlap here between these patients. A little bit of overlap here with cardiovascular disease, no overlap with angina, no overlap with coronary heart disease, very little overlap between heart disease. And so what that suggested to these epidemiologists and these scientists was that those individuals with higher levels of BPA in their urine showed significantly higher incidence of diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. There was almost no overlap of those with and without diabetes and cardiovascular disease beyond about 4 to 5 parts per million. And so these were implicated as BPA, higher levels of exposure is going to lead to diabetes and cardiovascular diseases in humans. And the same is true for angina, coronary heart disease, and heart attack. BPA levels higher in those with the disease. There was a significant difference between those that did not have the disease and those that did have the disease, suggesting that these out here had higher concentrations of BPA in their body, and as a result, it led to these health effects in these individual patients. And again, this was a very extensive study that looked at 1,455 patients. So this wasn't an isolated group. This was a large group from different genders, from different backgrounds, and really this showed the negative impacts of BPA on human health. So the epidemiology studies showed that there was a link with BPA in some health conditions, some very serious health conditions, such as heart disease and diabetes. This work was done by epidemiologists. In addition to that work, we need other scientists, other doctors to look at BPA and other compounds to see how they affect a mammal or an organism inside their body. And so for that, we turn to toxicologists. These are scientists who study the properties of a particular chemical and how it affects cells or tissue. They do two types of experiments: in vivo experiments, where they inject this cute little guinea pig with the toxin and they see, does it kill the organism, for example. Or they conduct in vitro experiments. These are in glass or in solution, and so you have these compounds or these toxins in this small drop right here, and you drop these toxins in this test tube here in glass, and here are the cells, or here are the enzymes, or here are the molecules, and you want to see how this toxin affects these cells. So a toxicologist is going to gather all sorts of data from doing these experiments in live organisms, looking at the physiology and anatomy and how that changes, and they're also going to get a lot of data and information from looking at these toxins in the test tube or in a petri dish in vitro. The reason we use test animals is, again, it's unethical, and perhaps you think it's unethical to do it on animals, but it's certainly unethical to do this on humans. And so we use guinea pigs, we use rabbits, because, again, the physiology, these are mammals, their biochemistry physiology is extremely similar to ours, and so we can study the effects on these organisms and not have to do it on humans. In 1997, in the journal Environmental Health Perspectives, was an article by Nigel et al. Titled Relative Binding Affinity Serum Modified Access Assay Predicts the Relative In Vivo Bioactivity of Xenoestrogens, Bisphenol A, and Octylphenol. And in this study, they documented the effects of low-dose bisphenol A on prostate size of male pups, so they're looking at male offspring whose mothers were fed one of 2 doses of BPA when they were pregnant, and they compared those to males whose mothers were not fed BPA. And these were in vivo studies, so these were studies inside the mice. The results of the study are presented here. On the y-axis, we have prostate weight in milligrams, the mass. In the x-axis, we have bisphenol A in concentration of parts per billion. And you noticed here, these are the mice that whose mothers were not given any toxin, and so the average prostate rate was somewhere around 43 milligrams. These were the mice whose mothers were fed 2 parts per billion bisphenol A, and their average prostate weight of the male pups was around 53 milligrams. And then those females that were given 20 parts per billion, the average weight of the prostate for male pups was around 55 milligrams. The overall body size for all of these did not vary, and so the body size of these organisms were the same as the pups from these organisms were the same as these pups here. What did change were the prostate gland, the size for those organisms whose mothers were exposed to BPA. You can see that they had higher prostate sizes, significantly larger than the control group that were not exposed to the toxins. And they used statistics. They looked at the p-values, and the p-values were extremely small. And so these findings were the first time to show that fetal exposure to environmentally relevant parts per billion dose of bisphenol A in the range that is currently being consumed by people can alter adult reproductive systems in mice. In vitro or in glass studies were conducted by Ishiro and Suzuki in their work that was published in the Journal of Health Science in 2010. And in that, the researchers had a petri dish, and this petri dish had different concentrations of bisphenol A, and they actually dropped rat neural stem cells onto the dishes, and they wanted to look at how those stem cells migrated out of the droplet across the dish. They measured on average how far the cells migrated in both the test and control groups. And this graph summarizes their results. On the y-axis we have migration distance, and this is compared to the control experiments in which there was no bisphenol A in the Petri dish. And on the x-axis we have bisphenol A BPA concentrations in parts per billion, and this is logarithmic scale. And this result showed that BPA had a negative effect on cell migration when compared to the control cells. Those cells that experienced higher concentrations of BPA migrated much less than those cells that had no BPA. And the reason they were looking at cell migration is because they were essentially looking at cell survival. So the higher the concentration of BPA, the less migration, the less survival for those rat neural cells. Those cells that were not exposed to BPA were actually able to migrate out away from that drop and able to survive. And so now we have studies with bisphenol A, both in vivo studies in rat models and in vitro studies in Petri dishes, done by different research groups, by different funding organizations. Both studies showing the negative effects of BPA. One examined prostate size and BPA, and the other one looked at BPA and cell survival. Bisphenol A, BPA, is an endocrine disruptor. These are chemicals that interfere with the body's endocrine system, and they produce adverse developmental, reproductive, neurological, immune effects in both humans and wildlife. In determining the toxicity, there are a lot of different variables that one must consider. Genetics, age, health status of the person. These are individual factors. Some toxins are more of a problem when very young, some are very old, others that have compromised immune systems. Genetic factors may also affect a person's ability, making them more or less vulnerable to a toxin. And finally, exposure. How frequently are you exposed to this, whether it comes in through your skin, whether you ingest it, whether you inhale this, whether it makes contact with your eyes. All of this is going to make a tremendous impact on how it affects a person or wildlife or plant or other organism in the ecosystem. Endocrine disruptors look and behave in the body like hormones, like estrogen. These are steroid hormones. They are hydrophobic molecules. They have these ring structures, and that allows them to cross right through the cell, through the lipid bilayer, and go into the cell itself. Bisphenol A is an endocrine disruptor because in the body, the geometry, the chemistry of bisphenol A looks very much like estrogen. And so it's able to go through the lipid bilayer and behave just like estrogen. When the hormone goes through the lipid bilayer, it actually complexes and binds with DNA in the cell nucleus. In the binding event, it actually activates the genes. So the DNA is our genetic blueprint. These genes are turned on and off because of the endocrine system and these hormones that come in and turn these genes on or turn other genes off. As a result, the genes turned on produces RNA. The RNA directs the synthesis of a protein, and the protein are enzymes. They're the workers in our body. They get everything done biochemically that we need to get done. And so this protein is made, and this protein has a function, and it goes about its function. Where the problem comes is if you have bisphenol A or you have some other endocrine disruptor that looks and behaves just like estrogen, your body ingests this gene is turned on when it's not supposed to be turned on, and as a result you're going to have all sorts of developmental, reproductive, neurological problems because this protein, for example, is being turned on when it's not supposed to be on. There are a wide variety of endocrine disruptors. DDT and other pesticides are good examples. Plasticizers such as bisphenol A, dioxins, dioxin-like compounds. These are all endocrine disruptors. They can be found as flame retardants, as detergents, in foods, in toys, cosmetics, pesticides. They get into our water, we come in contact with them, and then once they're in our body, they behave just like many of our hormones. They're involved in our endocrine disruptor, and they're going to turn genes on and off, producing proteins when we're not supposed to have proteins being produced. And that's going to cause a lot of problems in humans and wildlife and all organisms on Earth. Endocrine disruptors can cause big problems in very small doses. They can have additive effects where two chemicals add together and give you an increased effect on the person. They can have an antagonistic effect where you have compound A, you have compound B, and they both lessen the effect of each other. And so compound A plus B is actually less than would be expected. They can also have a synergistic effect. You have compound A in your body, compound B in your body, and they combine together and they give you a much bigger outcome than you had originally anticipated. And it's very hard to predict how these things are going to react in a person because this largely varies by age, by gender, by race, by how much you are exposed to these. Are you an embryo or a fetus? Are you an adolescent? Are you an adult? And so this makes it very difficult for doctors and scientists to understand how endocrine disruptors such as dioxins, such as DDT, such as bisphenol A, how they're going to behave in your body when you're exposed to so many of them at one time. Defining, what makes something poisonous may seem simple, but in reality to toxicologists it's very hard to determine what makes a dose poisonous. Again, this is going to vary by your exposure. Are you eating it? Are you inhaling it? You're touching your skin? How frequently are you exposed to this? Are you a young male? Are you a young female? Or are you an older adult? A very good example of endocrine disruptors in an ecosystem is the Chesapeake Bay area. So here is the United States, the eastern part of the United States. If we blow up this red rectangle here is the Chesapeake Bay watershed, right near Washington, D.C. So you have West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, all part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Endocrine disruptors have been detected and are currently in this watershed. You can see it drains a very large area, and particularly the urban areas are ones that are most worrisome because you have such high populations of people in these areas, and so you have the potential to affect large numbers of the population. The documentary from PBS Frontline, titled Poison Waters, looks at endocrine disruptors in the Chesapeake Bay and specifically the Potomac River, which feeds into Washington, D.C., and from which millions of people get their drinking water supplies from. The National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, the NIH, will also be involved in these studies, and you will look at how endocrine system functions, how it operates, how it's supposed to operate, and how bisphenol A and other endocrine disruptors can cause problems. You'll also look at the river itself. How do these chemicals get in there? How does it affect the fish, the wildlife, the frogs in these areas? And they will actually dissect smallmouth bass from these areas, and you can see such things as male intersex or oocytes that develop in the testes of largemouth and smallmouth bass. So you have male fish that are developing female parts, the feminization of these organisms, and how this is causing a lot of problems in that ecosystem. So it's not just these endocrine disruptors, that this dioxin, this bisphenol A, that this DDT can cause impacts on humans, but it actually is causing very bad reproductive and developmental problems for many of the organisms that live in the Potomac River and around the Potomac River watershed, the Chesapeake Bay watershed.
Six years ago, marine biologists became alarmed at reports of massive fish kills on the rivers in this region. Every year, smallmouth bass were being decimated by some mysterious problem. Spring and fall, hundreds of fish would be found floating in the water, belly up.
So you see this.
I caught up with Vicki Blazer, a fish pathologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, who was trying to figure out why the fish were dying. What do we got here?
So here we have this large discolored area in the liver.
Yeah.
And then you see all these little white spots. Here's another totally discolored area.
And that's a signal of some bigger problem.
Yes, when we see a really high prevalence in a population, that indicates there's some problem going on in that water.
And when Blazer dug deeper, she found a surprise.
One of the major and most interesting findings was intersex in the male bass. When we look at the male gonads or testes, what we find is immature eggs within the male testes.
So you got sort of feminization of male fish. Is that a big alarming finding in marine biology, aquatic biology?
Yes, and that has certainly attracted a lot of concern and attention.
Scientific studies have linked abnormal mutations in marine creatures, like intersex, to exposure to chemical compounds that mimic or imitate natural hormones in the body. These chemicals are called endocrine disruptors.
Endocrine disruptors are very, very potent chemicals at infinitesimally small quantification. I mean, you're talking about parts per million or parts per billion. They interrupt the normal way in which the body controls everything from growth and development to thyroid function to reproductive function to estrogen levels, testosterone levels. So they're very, very important, and they are a deep concern because there's so many of them now.
There are thousands of these worrisome chemicals that have gotten into the environment, and one reason is that they're part of everything we do.
The list of things that bring these organic pollutants into our bodies is a long list, and it ranges from home care products, soaps, toothpaste, cleaning agents in the household, to things we put on our lawns, the things that we use all the time, the plastic industry, the rubber industry, lubricants, fuels, the highways.
When you see scientists like Vicki Blazer cutting open fish, finding intersex in the male fish, seeing high levels of fish kills, seeing immune systems disrupted, seeing other damage to the fish, is that a warning to you potentially about human health?
Oh, absolutely. The warning not just from the smallmouth bass in the Potomac, but from amphibians all across the country. You have frogs with 6 legs, hermaphroditic frogs, male frogs with ovaries, female frogs with male genitalia. These are the canaries, the modern canary in the mine, that we haven't been paying enough attention to.
Poisoned Waters. Watch online or on air beginning April 21st.
Here are the persistent pollutants that we've discussed so far in class. This is CFC, chlorofluorocarbon. Has a half-life of decades. It's found in the atmosphere. It was used as a refrigerant agent. It destroys the ozone layer. As a result, more ultraviolet light comes to the surface of the planet, and it causes skin cancer. Montreal Protocol banned these, and all 96 states or nations finally ratified the Montreal Protocol a few years ago, and so this is slowly being phased out. Dichloryl diphenyl trichloroethane, DDT. This was written about in Rachel Carson's famous book, Silent Spring. It's a hydrophobic compound because of these ring structure. It hates water. It accumulates in fatty tissues. It's an insecticide that was widely used for several decades, and it persists in the environment, has a half-life of decades. These are polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs. These were used in the electrical industry, airlines industry, Boeing, General Electric, half-life of decades. It's found in soil, waters, in the atmosphere. Just like DDT, it is a carcinogen. It causes developmental and reproductive problems in humans. It's hydrophobic because of these ring structure. It hates water. It accumulates in fatty tissues. And this is perhaps a major concern all over the world in terms of persistent pollutants. In the United States, this is found in the Great Lakes and Puget Sound and the Hudson River watershed, also in industrial areas in Indiana and other parts of New York State. And finally, bisphenol A, or BPA. Again, these are ring structures that make it a hydrophobic molecule. However, the liver does metabolize it very quickly and turns it into a soluble form that people pass in their urine. Has a half-life of days in a person. The problem is we're exposed to this, especially young children, day after day, hour after hour, and so even though it's passed out the liver, new supplies of this comes in our diet as we're exposed to the plastics and other materials that were made from bisphenol A. The problem with bisphenol A is it looks very much like estrogen, and so it acts as a mimic to estrogen and disrupts our endocrine system. And in the Poisoned Waters video, you watched how it can cause the feminization of fish and other organisms living in the aquatic ecosystems. So these are 4 of the persistent pollutants. There are hundreds of these. These 4 are man-made compounds. Again, we did not follow the precautionary tale. We basically said, look, we're going to try these out on humans, and we'll find out if they cause any adverse effects, and then after we determine that, we'll stop using them and try to determine how we're going to clean up many of these areas that are contaminated with these types of pollutants. So it wasn't manufactured, these pollutants were not manufactured as hazards in the first place. We wanted to use them for products to make our lives better, but in the long term, we didn't know enough about them at the time. Now we do, and now we're not using any of these compounds because they cause serious problems like cancer. We talked about toxicologists, and toxicologists use in vivo and in vitro studies to look at how poisonous a compound can be. And many of these studies, they determine the lethal dose, LD50. This is the amount of the substance that when given to a test organism, such as a test rat, that's going to kill or cause the death of 50% of that population. So if I have a population of 100 guinea pigs and I feed 100 of them a particular concentration of toxin A and it kills 50% of the population, that is the LD50. LD refers to lethal dose, and again, we don't test these on humans. We test these on small mammals because it's unethical to do to humans. Again, you could argue that it's unethical to do to mammals as well. But that's beyond the scope of this class. We use these test animals because they are mimics to our physiology and our anatomy, and that's why the test animals are employed. Again, It could be considered by some to be highly unethical to do that, to put these organisms through that pain and suffering. But again, that's beyond the scope of this class. We have bioethics classes at Ohio State and elsewhere that you can explore these types of issues. Again, toxicologists are going to use this one number because it predicts acute toxicity. So you are exposed to this immediately. Are you going to die from it? Are you going to become sick from it right now, immediately? Typically, the lethal dose is given in terms of milligrams per kilogram of body weight. What we see down here in this table are several compounds that I'm sure you're familiar with. Arsenic, dioxin, mercury, and cyanide. All of these are extremely toxic to humans and all other mammals. If we look at arsenic, it's a big problem in watersheds, in groundwater. Arsenic, toxicologists tested it on mice, and they injected different concentrations of arsenic to the mice to see what the LD50 was, and they determined that the concentration that killed 50% of the population was 140 milligrams per kilogram of mouse. So that's with mice. You know, we're concerned with humans. So how much could kill a typical human? An average adult is going to weigh about 70 kilograms, and so this concentration works out to about 2 nickels, so about 9.86 grams. So 2 nickels that we use to buy something from the vending machine. Dioxin is another very toxic compound. Dioxin, you guys probably know it as Agent Orange. Dioxin actually is the scientific name, the chemical name is tetrachlorodibenzoyl-paradioxin. It was used as a herbicide to kill all plants in Vietnam, and it was used for about 10 years, from 1961 to 1971. The U.S. military forces sprayed it all over Vietnam, sprayed it over portions of Laos and Cambodia, and the purpose was to kill all the trees so that they could see the enemy, and also kill all the crops so that the enemy did not have food supplies. And again, most people were unaware of how toxic this compound was, and we sprayed massive amounts of this material over millions of acres of land. This material is extremely toxic, it turns out. When tested on guinea pigs and we feed this to them orally, the lethal dose is 0.0006 milligrams per kilogram. What that works out to the average adult is 0.04 milligram. This is actually too tiny for us to see. A grain of sand, less than a grain of sand, is actually enough to kill 50% of the humans that ingest that. So this is a very dangerous compound. It happens to be all throughout Vietnam right now because it has a long lifespan and is a big concern for people living in that area. Dioxin can be broken down by microorganisms in the soil, by sunlight, and so that lifespan is going to depend on where it's found. If it's on a leaf surface, the lifespan, the half-life is probably 1 to 3 years. If it's in the soil where it's not going to be exposed to sunlight, it can be 10 to 15 years half-life. So this is an herbicide that we used. It's very toxic, and again, it can kill humans in very small doses. Mercury, if we treat that in dermal tissue and skin tissue of rats, has a lethal dose 50 of 40 milligrams per kilogram, and this equates to an average person would, if they were to ingest 2.72 grams, about the size of 1 penny, would be enough to kill 50% of the people that ingested that. And finally, cyanide. Cyanide is very toxic to aerobic organisms. It stops oxygen's ability to serve as a terminal electron acceptor, and it kills you very quickly. If we administer this to rats, give them oral doses, it has a lethal dose of 6.4 milligrams per kilogram, and that equates to about 0.44 grams, or about 1 flea is enough to kill a human being. So again, a toxicologist is going to look at these compounds and they want one number. How much is going to kill 50% of my population? That's this number right here. And so we can compare this number among these compounds, and we can say that dioxin is much, much more toxic than arsenic. We can actually tolerate higher concentrations of arsenic before it kills us. Dioxin, though, if we're exposed to that, we're going to be in really serious health concern. As we've seen with the previous slide, small concentrations of a compound can have dramatic effects on a mammal, on a human. We looked at endocrine disruptor BPA. It acts as an estrogen mimic, so it binds to estrogen receptors and it triggers the DNA, the genes, to manufacture proteins when they should not be manufactured. This leads to a feminization of males, it leads to lower sperm counts, and it leads to the production of egg proteins in male organisms. Unfortunately, many of these chemical compounds are hard to predict on what their effects are going to be. The endocrine disruptors don't follow the dose makes the poison mentality. They can have one type of effects at a low dose and no effect at higher doses. So it's very hard to predict, again, when you look at different ages, different races, different genders, how a toxin such as BPA is going to impact that human. And this is disconcerting to most people because, you know, when we see these compounds, we want to know what's going to happen if I ingest them. What's going to happen if I ingest compound A and compound B? What's going to happen if I ingest compound A, B, and C, and I'm this many years old? I'm 15 years old, or I'm 20 years old, whatever it may be. And we want these answers. Unfortunately, toxicologists and epidemiologists and scientists, we can't provide those answers because we don't know ourselves. We don't have the data set to tell us, and we just don't have the money to explore these different combinations of drugs. Tax dollars pay for most of these studies, and we already spend billions of dollars a year on research to look at specific drugs, and it's very difficult for us to have the funding to look at combinations of these drugs. And even if we did have the funding, it's often hard to determine when you look at maybe a dozen different drugs in a person's body at once, how do you determine that drug A caused this effect and not drug C? And how do you look at a male versus a female? Or how do you look at a person that lives in the Midwest versus a person that lives in the South? How do you look at a 2-year-old versus a 90-year-old? All of these things come into play, and it's extremely expensive and extremely difficult to consider all of these factors and design experiments that are going to take all of these factors into account. Different compounds can show different effects on the human. So this is an LD50 curve shown right here, and on the x-axis is our dose. We're giving different compounds to our test subjects, and we're seeing how much does it take to kill our test subjects. We're using mice, or we're using guinea pigs, or we're using rabbits. Substance A, shown here in white, has this linear response. And so as we increase the dose, we also increase the amount of the population that we kill until we get to this 50% value, and boom, we can see that our LD50 is 28 parts per million for compound A. Some compounds and substances have a nonlinear response, and so this is an S-shaped curve here. And you can see that you can go clear up to 30 parts per million, 40 parts per million. Finally, we reach this threshold of 50% kill rate, death rate, and that corresponds to 42 parts per million for substance B. So again, this is what a toxicologist is going to use. They're going to take these substances, they're going to inject them into the mouse, they're going to give them orally, dermally, they're going to give them to them somehow, and then they're going to measure what percent of that population dies. When do they get 50% of that population to die? And from that, that's going to give us our lethal dose. So if we were to compare substance A to substance B, we can say that substance A is more toxic because its lethal dose is 28 parts per million, whereas this compound we can actually tolerate, or mammals can actually tolerate higher doses before it actually kills them, and the LD50 is somewhere around 42 parts per million. And you can say, well, this is a crude way to look at substance A and substance B in this mammals, and I agree, and I think most toxicologists would agree. We're not looking at, what type of health effects do they incur over time. We're merely seeing, does it kill the population or does it not kill that population? So even though the LD50 for compound A is 28 parts per million, that doesn't mean that this is safe levels for you to ingest. These mice that are ingesting these levels are developing health problems, and eventually they're going to die. So it's not as if these guys are all healthy, and then all of a sudden they die. No, as you give these guys more and more higher and higher doses of this compound, they're developing problems with the cellular level, they're developing problems with tissue, they're developing problems with their organs, until you actually reach 50% of the organisms dying. And as you continue to go up, you're going to see when you kill 100%. So this corresponds to about 55 parts per million. So at this concentration, you're going to kill all of the test subjects. In this case, this S-shaped curve, you actually reach 100% of the organisms killed, somewhere around 70 parts per million. So again, we're looking for one number because this one number allows us to, using this one number, compare substance A, substance B, substance C, and determine which one of these is more toxic. That allows our government agencies to set safe drinking water limits on something like mercury or something like bisphenol A, so that we can begin to set limits on exposure. Lower values are going to indicate more toxic compounds. So again, in this case, the LD50, again, we're going to draw a straight line here, and where they cross these graphs is the LD50. So for substance A, it's 28 parts per million. That suggests that this is a more toxic chemical compound, and this is the one that we need to be most concerned about. If we go to substance B, it has this S-shaped curve here. Again, the LD50, that's going to kill 50% of our population, corresponds to 42 parts per million. So again, this is toxic, but we can, as mammals, tolerate it. More of this compound than we can this one. So this one's less toxic here. This substance here is more toxic. Government agencies like the National Institutes of Health, the Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, they all want to know the threshold or safe dose. We don't want to go clear up to the LD50 because we don't want to kill 50% of our population. We want to know what is a safe dose down here that we can be exposed to in our daily lives, and it's not going to cause the adverse health effects that these higher concentrations will. And so a lot of times continue testing of these effects at higher doses, or starting at higher doses and reducing the doses over time, or we may or may not see some effects. For endocrine disruptors, high and low doses are going to affect the organism differently, and so we're going to have to, as toxicologists, take this into consideration. And so basically finding a safe threshold dose is extremely difficult for the most brilliant minds, most brilliant toxicologists and epidemiologists to figure out, and that's because these are small molecules. They are going to react with the trillions of molecules that we have naturally occurring in our cells, and as they interact with them at different concentrations during different life cycles, during different times in our lives, during different genders, different races, they're going to have dramatically different outcomes that make it very difficult to come up with threshold safe doses. So the government regulatory agencies such as the Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, National Institutes of Health, they want to understand what amounts are going to be safe for us to come in contact with each day. And once we know the threshold dose, or the dose where these negative impacts can finally be observed, we want to add a factor of 100 or 1,000 to be on the safe side. So for example, if evidence suggests that some toxin is safe at 100 parts per million, then we're going to set the standard at 1 part per million for adults, and perhaps 1/1000th of this, which would be 0.1 parts per million in children, because we know that children, fetuses, embryos, pregnant females are going to probably want to be at the lower concentrations. If you go to this website right here, this is the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. This is their list of contaminants, and they will let you know what the contaminant is, what are the potential health effects, where you're going to come in contact, and what are the safe drinking standards for you. They're going to look at microorganisms, disinfectants, disinfectant byproducts, inorganic chemicals, organic chemicals, and radionuclides. It's a very extensive list that is updated regularly, and it's a great place to start to get information on what is in the drinking water in the United States, what should be avoided, and what is considered a safe drinking concentration for the different toxins. Oftentimes, companies or other organizations that manufacture harmful compounds will use arguments, will use data to confuse or sway the reader or listener to accept a particular position. And so these are some examples. They'll draw too broad a conclusion or from too little evidence. They will present information that exaggerates the claims and does not directly support the data that was presented in the primary source journal article. They will attack a person or group that has an opposing view. They will not present direct evidence, but they will say, don't look at what's in my left hand, just look what's in my right hand, and they'll try to take this backward view of confusing you or presenting you with data that sways to their side of the argument. They may very often say that the issue is too complex, or we are not capable of understanding this. And finally, they can set up this black or white argument. And in science, as you'll see throughout the semester, as you have probably already experienced, in science many things are not black and white. They are complex, and so simple arguments are not justified in explaining the data that's presented.